Ghostbusters, Blackout. Chapter 1. The old firehouse on the corner of Northmore and Varick was quiet that muggy July morning. Too quiet, thought Ray Stantz as he sipped his coffee and flipped through the latest issue of Parapsychology Today. The thick, humid air seemed to muffle any sound, amplifying the unnatural stillness that hung over the Ghostbusters headquarters. Ray shifted uneasily in his seat, the sticky vinyl upholstery clinging to his skin. He had grown accustomed to a certain level of organized chaos during his tenure with the Ghostbusters, the wail of sirens piercing the air as Ecto-1 raced out to answer a call, the acrid scent of smoke as Egon tinkered with some new contraption that inevitably burst into flames, the lilting cadence of Peter's voice talking a pretty client while simultaneously hurling barbs at a pushy reporter, the steady baritone of Winston's no-nonsense voice cutting through the din to restore order. But today, the firehouse felt more like a mausoleum, the silence pressing in on Ray from all sides. Even the ever-present hum of equipment seemed muted, the proton packs hanging lifelessly on their racks like slumbering metallic beasts. Dust motes floated lazily through the stagnant air, catching the pale fingers of sunlight that managed to penetrate the grimed-streaked windows. Ray sighed, his leg bouncing restlessly as he tried to focus on the dense academic text in front of him. The words seemed to blur together, his mind unable to shake the sense of foreboding that prickled at the base of his skull. As the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, Ray's colleagues trickled in one by one, each registering the unusual atmosphere with varying degrees of curiosity and unease. Egon was first to arrive, his brow arching sharply over the frames of his glasses as he took in the scene. "Fascinating," he murmured, consulting the PK meter strapped to his belt. "The psychokinetic energy readings are almost non-existent this morning. I've never seen them this low." "Good," came Peter's voice from the doorway, his tone laden with its usual mix of sarcasm and bravado. "Maybe we can actually get some peace and quiet around here for once." He sauntered into the room and plopped down at his desk, kicking his feet up on the cluttered surface with a thud. "After that nasty Class 5 we dealt with in the Bronx last week, I could use a little vacation." Winston chuckled as he emerged from the kitchen, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Since when is one day without a call a vacation?" He leaned against the doorframe, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "I seem to recall you complaining about being bored out of your mind the last time we had a slow day." Ray didn't join in the good-natured ribbing, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his desk. "I don't know, guys," he said quietly, his brow furrowed with concern. "Something doesn't feel right. It's never this quiet." As if on cue, the intercom on Janine's desk crackled to life, her queen's accent slicing through the stillness like a knife. "We got a live one, boys," she announced, her usually unflappable voice tinged with a note of urgency. "Mayor's on the horn, and he sounds rattled. Says there's been reports of blackouts all over Manhattan." Ray shot to his feet, his mud clattering to the desk and sloshing coffee across a stack of papers. "I knew it," he exclaimed, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and trepidation. "This has to be paranormal in nature. No way it's just a coincidence." Peter rolled his eyes, his feet thumping back to the floor. "Relax, Ray," he drawled, his tone equal parts patronizing and placating. "It's the middle of summer in the city. Everyone and their mothers got their AC cranked up to Arctic levels. The power grid's probably just overloaded." But Egon was already shaking his head, the PK meter in his hand emitting an ominous series of beeps and whirs. "I'm not so sure, Venkman," he said gravely, his eyes fixed on the spiking readings. "These energy fluctuations are highly abnormal. There may very well be a paranormal component at play here." Winston was already halfway to the lockers, his jaw set with determination. Only one way to find out, he called over his shoulder as he yanked open the metal door to reveal a row of neatly hung flight suits. Let's roll, gentlemen. The next few moments passed in a blur of activity as the teens scrambled to gear up, the once silent firehouse suddenly alive with the thrum of charging proton packs and the clatter of heavy boots on the stairs. Ray felt a familiar rush of adrenaline surge through his veins as he slid behind the wheel of Ecto-1, the souped-up 1959 Cadillac roaring to life with a throaty growl. As they tore out of the garage and into the strangely darkened streets of Manhattan, Ray couldn't help the grin that tugged at the corners of his mouth. The thrill of the hunt, the allure of the unknown, the chance to pit their wits and weaponry against the forces of the supernatural, this was what he lived for. Something wicked this way comes, he thought with a shiver of anticipation. And the Ghostbusters would be there to face it head-on, to protect the city they had sworn to serve. But as the towering skyscrapers of Midtown loomed ahead, their windows dark and lifeless, Ray felt a flicker of unease in the pit of his stomach. Little did he know, as Ecto-1 hurtled through the eerie, twilit streets, that this would be a case like no other, one that would push the team to their limits, both physically and mentally, and forever change the face of the city they called home. The firehouse faded in the rearview mirror, the last bastion of normalcy before the world went black. And as the first fat drops of rain began to spatter against the windshield, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that they were driving headlong into the heart of a storm, one that would test their courage, their sanity, and their very humanity. The Ghostbusters were about to face their darkest hour, and the only way out was through. Chapter 2. The discordant wail of Ecto-1's siren echoed through the stifling air as the converted ambulance threaded its way between abandoned vehicles and terrified citizens. The unnatural darkness seemed to swallow the city block by block, an oppressive presence that sent a chill down Ray's spine as he gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles. "This is no ordinary blackout," Ray muttered, his voice tight with apprehension. He glanced over at Egon in the passenger seat, seeing his own unease mirrored in the physicist's furrowed brow. Egon's gaze remained fixed on the PKE meter in his hands, the device's frantic beeping filling the car's interior. "The PKE valences are increasing exponentially with each successive grid failure," he stated, his tone clinical yet laced with an undercurrent of dread. "These readings are consistent with the presence of a Class 7 entity, possibly higher." From the back seat, Peter leaned forward, his usual smirk replaced by a look of genuine concern. "Whoa, hold up, did you say Class 7 as in the kind of spook that can bend the laws of physics and melt your face clean off?" "Precisely," Egon confirmed, his voice flat. Winston, ever the pragmatist, spoke up from beside Peter. "Whatever this thing is, we need to track it down fast. The mayor made it pretty clear the city's about 2 seconds away from a full-blown riot." As if on cue, the tinkling crash of shattering glass punctuated his words, followed closely by the rising cacophony of panicked screams and scuffling from a storefront nearby. Ray's grip tightened on the steering wheel, a bead of cold sweat trickling down his temple. In his years as a Ghostbuster, he'd seen some seriously weird stuff, but this felt different. Bigger somehow. The inky blackness pressing in from all sides wasn't just an absence of light. It was a tangible presence, icy tendrils of malevolence probing, seeking. Ecto-1's tires squealed against the pavement as Ray brought the vehicle to an abrupt stop outside City Hall. A sea of reporters and irate citizens had gathered, brandishing microphones and signs as they shouted at the harried-looking mayor. The team pushed their way through the crowd, their distinctive uniforms drawing a smattering of cheers, and more than a few jeers. "Ghostbusters, thank God," the mayor exclaimed, mopping his gleaming brow with a silk handkerchief. Please, tell me you boys can get a handle on this situation before it spirals any further out of control. Ray opened his mouth to deliver some much-needed reassurance, but his words were lost in the sudden, ear-splitting boom of lightning that sent the assembled crowd scattering like startled pigeons. In the afterglow of the blinding flash, Egon's PKE meter shrieked like a tortured banshee, its dials spinning wildly. "It's here!" Egon yelled over the rising howl of wind whipping down the narrow street. "The entity is drawing power directly from the city's electrical grid." The words had scarcely left his lips when a shimmering, writhing shape emerged from a storm drain, crackling with sizzling arcs of stolen electricity. The Ghostbusters watched, equal parts awestruck and horrified, as the amorphous mass solidified into a towering, skeletal figure. Lightning danced in its empty eye sockets, twisted jaws gaping in a soundless howl of rage. "Holy Mother of Gozer," Peter breathed, his voice uncharacteristically small. The specter reared back, unleashing an unearthly shriek that sent shockwaves of force slamming into the surrounding buildings. Windows exploded in glittering clouds of glass, car alarms wailing in discordant chorus. With a final hiss of ozone, the entity vanished, leaving only ruin and primal terror in its wake. Ray swallowed hard against the frantic pounding of his heart, his hands shaking as he wiped the sweat from his eyes. This was uncharted territory, even for the Ghostbusters. They were up against an enemy unlike anything they'd faced before, and the stakes couldn't be higher. The team piled back into Ecto 1, tearing off in pursuit of the Spectre's fading PKE trail. As he guided the car through the labyrinth of darkened streets, Ray couldn't shake the gnawing certainty that this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, lurking in the shadows, waited an unfathomable force hellbent on dragging the city down into an abyss of endless night. It was up to them to stop it, or die trying. Chapter 3. The trail of destruction left by the electrokinetic entity led the Ghostbusters to the outskirts of the city, where the hulking ruins of an abandoned power plant loomed like a sleeping giant. Rust-stained smokestacks pierced the overcast sky, reaching towards the heavens like accusing fingers. The cracked asphalt of the parking lot was choked with weeds, nature slowly reclaiming what man had forsaken. Ray pulled the Ecto 1 to a stop at the crumbling gates, a chill running down his spine despite the warm summer air. He killed the engine, and the car settled with a weary sigh, as if even it sensed the foreboding that hung over this place. "Why is it always the creepy, abandoned places?" Peter grumbled from the passenger seat, his voice shattering the uneasy silence. He hefted his proton pack onto his shoulders with a grunt, the heavy equipment settling into place with a familiar, almost comforting weight. "Just once, I'd like to bust a ghost in a 5-star resort, chasing specters poolside with a margarita in hand. If we do this right, maybe we can afford a vacation one of these days," Winston quipped from the back seat. He slid out of the car and stretched his long legs, working out the kinks from the tense drive. His dark eyes scanned the power plant, his military training kicking in as he assessed potential threats and exit strategies. Egon was already moving, his lanky form unfolding from the car with surprising grace. He consulted his PKE meter, the device's twin antennas twitching and swaying like dowsing rods seeking water in a barren desert. The screen cast an eerie blue glow on his angular features, highlighting the intensity of his focus. "The psychokinetic energy readings are off the charts," he reported, his voice tight with barely suppressed excitement. "If our electrical specter is hiding anywhere, it's here." Winston cocked his particle thrower, the hum of the weapon charging sending a tingle up his arm. His jaw was set in a determined line, his eyes hard as flint. Then let's light this candle and send Sparky back to the great power grid in the sky. Ray took a deep breath, trying to settle the butterflies in his stomach. No matter how many busts they went on, that first moment of contact always set his nerves jangling. But beneath the anxiety was a thrill, the heady rush of adrenaline that came with staring down the unknown. He lived for that feeling, craved it like a junkie craved his next fix. Ghostbusting wasn't just a job for Ray, it was a calling, a compulsion. And right now, that compulsion was screaming at him to get moving. As the team approached the rusted doors of the power plant, Ray couldn't help but marvel at the sheer scope of the structure. It was a cathedral of industry, a monument to the ingenuity and hubris of man. Towering walls of pitted concrete and corroded metal stretched up into the sullen sky, blotting out the sun. Massive turbines sat silent and still, their once gleaming surfaces now pitted and scarred. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to shatter the sepulchral quiet. Ray reached out and grasped the handle of the heavy metal door. The rusted surface was rough and cold against his palm, and for a moment he imagined he could feel the building's slow pulse, the echoes of the power it had once controlled. Then, with a twist of his wrist and a screech of protesting hinges, the door swung open. Shadows engulfed them as they stepped inside, the weak light from outside barely penetrating the gloom. The air was thick and heavy, redolent with the acrid stench of oxidized metal and stagnant water. Their footsteps echoed in the cavernous space, the sound strangely muffled as if the very walls were absorbing the noise. Ahead, the skeletal remains of machinery lurked in the darkness, twisted silhouettes that seemed to shift and writhe in the corner of the eye. Egon took point, his PKE meter held out before him like a talisman. The device's indicator light strobed erratically, painting his face in lurid shades of red and green. Ray followed close behind, his heart pounding a tribal drumbeat in his ears. He could feel the weight of the abandoned plant pressing down on him, the accumulated despair of obsolescence and neglect. It was the feeling of something forgotten, something left to rot, and in that rot, dark things festered. Without warning, the PK meter shrieked, the sound as harsh as a slash of fingernails on a chalkboard. The antennas stood at rigid attention, quivering like divining rods. "It's here," Egon shouted, his voice cracking with urgency. No sooner had the words left his mouth than a jagged bolt of lightning erupted from the darkness. Searing white light exploded across Ray's vision, and the stench of ozone flooded his nostrils. The thunderbolt slashed past Peter's head, so close that it singed his hair and left a scorch mark on the wall behind him. "Whoa!" Peter yelped, ducking instinctively. "I know I said I wanted some excitement, but this is a little too close for comfort." "You want excitement," a voice crackled, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'll give you excitement." The ghost materialized before them, its form crackling and seething with stolen energy. Jagged bolts of electricity danced over its surface, tracing the contours of a skeletal face frozen in a rictus of rage. Glowing eyes burned in sunken sockets, pulsing with ancient malevolence. It was even more terrifying up close, the embodiment of every childhood nightmare, every primal fear of the dark. "Killerwatt," Ray breathed, the name rising unbidden to his lips. With it came a surge of knowledge, a sudden crystalline understanding of the entity they faced. An electrokinetic specter that feeds on electricity, the more it consumes, the stronger it gets. "Great, we'll send it a thank you note for the science lesson," Peter said, his tone striving for nonchalance even as his eyes betrayed his fear. He unsheathed his particle thrower and leveled it at the ghost, finger hovering over the trigger. Now let's toast this sucker before it gives us all a permanent perm. The Ghostbusters opened fire, proton streams sizzling through the air like enraged serpents. The smell of ozone intensified as the beams ionized the very air they passed through, leaving glowing afterimages seared into Ray's retinas. But Killerwatt was fast, far faster than anything they had ever faced before. It zipped and zagged between the beams, its mocking laughter echoing from the rafters. "He's too quick," Winston yelled, his stream going wide as the ghost juked to the side at the last second. Sweat beaded on his brow as he fought to track the specter's erratic movements. "We can't get it locked." "Keep firing." Egon gritted out between clenched teeth. His face was a mask of concentration, eyes narrowed, as he tried to anticipate Killerwatt's next move. "We have to wear it down." But the ghost had other ideas. With a bellow of rage that shook the very foundations of the plant, Killerwatt unleashed a massive surge of energy. The concussive blast caught the Ghostbusters square in the chests, lifting them off their feet and hurling them backwards like rag dolls. Ray had a brief, dizzying sense of flight before his body slammed into a rusted generator housing with bone-crushing force. Stars exploded across his vision, and he tasted blood, sharp and coppery on his tongue. Through the high-pitched ringing in his ears, he heard the clatter of proton packs hitting the ground, the groans of his friends as they struggled to rise. "Ray." Peter's voice, strained and desperate. "Ray, are you okay?" Ray shook his head to clear it, instantly regretting the motion as pain spiked through his skull. He levered himself up onto his elbows, blinking hard to clear his blurred vision. The world spun drunkenly, and he thought for a moment he might be sick. I'm all right," he managed, the words feeling thick and clumsy in his mouth. "Just got my bell wrong." He looked up, and his heart seized in his chest. Killerwatt loomed over them, its form swollen with stolen energy. The ghost seemed to have doubled in size, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Lightning crackled over its surface in jagged, lashing arcs, and its laughter was the sizzle and pop of a downed power line. "You fools," it bellowed, its voice like the roar of a thunderstorm. "Did you really think your pathetic toys could stop me? I am Killerwatt. I am power incarnate." The ghost threw back its head, its laughter building to a deafening crescendo. Then, with a final crackle of electricity, it vanished, leaving only the stench of ozone and the echo of its mocking voice. Ray struggled to his feet, his whole body one giant bruise. He reached down and helped Winston up, the other man's face tight with pain. Peter and Egon were already moving, staggering to retrieve their fallen proton packs. They looked as battered as Ray felt, their jumpsuits torn and singed, their faces smudged with soot. But beneath the exhaustion and the pain was something else, something that sent a chill straight down Ray's spine. It was the grim realization that they were outmatched, that Killerwatt was more powerful than anything they had ever faced before. And with each passing second, it was growing stronger, feeding on the city's lifeblood like some monstrous parasite. As Ray helped his growing colleagues to their feet, a cold knot of dread settled in the pit of his stomach. Killerwatt was out there, a malevolent force of nature hell-bent on plunging the city into eternal darkness. And if they didn't find a way to stop it soon, that darkness would spread, a ravenous shadow that would consume everything in its path. The fate of New York, and possibly the world, rested in their hands. And right now, those hands were shaking. Chapter 4. The Ecto-1 limped back to the firehouse, its once gleaming white paint job smudged with soot and scorch marks. Inside, the mood was as grim as a graveyard at midnight. Ray Stantz slumped in the passenger seat, his body aching from the bruises blooming under his jumpsuit. But the pain in his pride cut deeper than any physical wound. He kept replaying the confrontation with Killerwatt in his head, each moment seared into his memory like a branding iron. The way the ghost had cackled as it absorbed their proton streams, growing brighter and more powerful with each blast. The sickening crunch of Egon's PKE meter exploding in a shower of sparks. The smell of singed hair as Winston's eyebrows got a little too close to the action. They'd been so cocky, so sure of themselves. After all, they were the Ghostbusters, the city's first and last line of defense against the things that went bump in the night. They'd faced down ancient Sumerian gods, cross-dimensional demons, even the Stay-Puft Marshmallow Man himself. What was one little lightning ghost compared to that? Plenty, as it turned out. Killerwatt wasn't just powerful, he was cunning. He'd led them into that trap at the power plant like lambs to the slaughter, toying with them until he got bored of the game. Then he'd swatted them aside like flies, leaving them battered, bruised, and utterly humiliated. As Winston guided the Ecto-1 into the firehouse garage, Ray fought the urge to put his fist through the window. He settled for slamming the door a little harder than necessary as he climbed out, ignoring the concerned looks from his teammates. Egon was already at the chalkboard, scribbling furiously with a stub of chalk. His glasses were cracked, his blonde pompadour singed, but his eyes burned with the intense focus that only a scientific puzzle could inspire. "We need a new strategy," he said without preamble, not looking up from his equations. Killerwatt's ability to absorb and redirect electrical energy makes him virtually immune to our proton packs. "No kidding," Peter drawled, wincing as he pressed a bat of ice to the goose eggs swelling on his forehead. "I feel like I just went 10 rounds with Mike Tyson on a bad day." Egon ignored him, lost in his own thoughts. If we can find a way to overload his absorption capabilities, force him to take in more power than he can handle. "We might be able to make him go pop," Ray finished, catching on. He could feel the gears turning in his own head, the thrill of the problem pushing back the sting of defeat. "Like a balloon with too much air." "Exactly." Egon tapped the chalk against his chin, leaving a smudge of white dust on his skin. But generating that kind of energy surge would require a massive power source, not to mention a way to channel it directly into Killerwatt. Winston snapped his fingers, his eyes lighting up. "The power plant, it's already wired to handle huge electrical loads. If we could rig up some kind of giant capacitor. We could turn the whole place into one big ghost trap," Ray breathed, the pieces falling into place. "Egon, you're a genius." Egon allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. "It's a simple matter of applied physics. I'll need to run some calculations, but I believe I can construct a device that will do the trick. We'll need to salvage parts from the plant itself, of course." "Of course," Peter muttered, rolling his eyes. "Because why buy new gear when you can just root around in a rusty death trap? Seriously, am I the only one who thinks this is completely insane?" Ray shot him a look, his jaw tightening. "You got a better idea, Venkman? Killerwatt's out there getting stronger by the minute. If we don't stop him now, there might not be a city left to haunt." Peter held up his hands in mock surrender, but there was a glint of something like fear in his eyes. Fine, but if I end up as a crispy critter, I'm coming back to haunt all of you." As the team split up to gather equipment, Ray felt a cold knot of dread settle in his stomach. This was by far the most dangerous thing they'd ever attempted, and that was saying something. Hunting ghosts was never a safe bet, but deliberately trying to overload a spectral entity with enough electricity to power Manhattan? That was tantamount to suicide. But what choice did they have? Killerwatt had already proven he was more than a match for their usual tactics. If they didn't take him out now, while they still had a chance, the blackouts would only spread. And when the lights went out on the Big Apple, well, Ray didn't want to think about what kind of chaos would ensue. He busied himself with loading proton packs and traps into the Ecto-1, trying not to dwell on the enormity of the task ahead. They were the Ghostbusters, damn it. They'd stared down the end of the world more times than he could count. They could handle one measly Class 7 electrokinetic manifestation. Couldn't they? By the time they rolled up to the power plant, the sun was sinking below the horizon, painting the sky a bruised purple. The derelict facility loomed before them like a slumbering giant, its crumbling smokestacks and shattered windows hinting at the decay within. Ray felt his skin prickle as he climbed out of the car, proton pack strapped to his back. The air smelled of ozone and burnt wiring, a sharp metallic tang that coated his tongue. He could almost feel the electricity humming through the ground beneath his feet, a low insistent throb that set his teeth on edge. "I'm getting some seriously weird readings," Egon murmured, fiddling with his ever-present PKE meter. "Killerwatt's definitely here, but his energy signature is scattered, almost like he's everywhere at once." "Great," Peter muttered, checking the charge on his neutrona wand. "A ghost that can be in multiple places at the same time, as if this wasn't already the worst idea ever." Winston clapped him on the shoulder, his face grim. "Come on, man, we've got a job to do. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can all go home and forget this ever happened." Ray nodded, swallowing hard. "Right, Egon, you get that capacitor set up. The rest of us will try to lure Killerwatt into position, remember. We need to keep him occupied long enough for the trap to power up. Whatever you do, don't let him drain your pack." They split up, each taking a different section of the plant. Ray found himself in a cavernous turbine room, the massive generators looming over him like slumbering beasts. Rusted catwalks crisscrossed the space above his head, disappearing into shadow. He moved cautiously, every nerve strung tight as a piano wire. The only sound was the soft scuff of his boots on concrete and the hum of his proton pack, a steady thrum that did little to calm his racing heart. A flicker of movement caught his eye, and he whirled, thrower at the ready. But it was just a rat, scurrying along the base of the wall. Ray let out a shaky breath, lowering his weapon. And then the rat stopped, its beady eyes glowing an electric blue. It twitched once, twice, and then began to grow, its body distorting and stretching into a nightmarish shape. Ray stumbled back, his finger tightening on the trigger. But before he could fire, the thing that had been a rat lunged at him, crackling with white-hot energy. He felt a searing pain in his chest, and then the world went dark. When he came to, he was lying on his back, staring up at a worried Peter Venkman. "Hey, Ray, can you hear me?" Ray blinked, his vision swimming. What happened?" "Killerwatt happened," Peter said grimly. "He's toying with us, Ray, popping up all over the place, zapping us when we least expect it. We need to regroup, come up with a new plan." Ray struggled to his feet, ignoring the way the room tilted around him. No, we stick to the plan. Egon's almost got the capacitor ready. We just need to keep Killerwatt occupied a little longer." Peter looked like he wanted to argue, but Winston cut him off. "Ray's right. We can't back down now, not when we're this close." They made their way deeper into the plant, towards the central control room where Egon was working. Every shadow seemed to flicker with menace, every creaking pipe a potential ambush. Ray's chest ached where Killerwatt had zapped him, a dull throbbing pain that made it hard to breathe. And then they were there, bursting into the control room with proton throwers blazing. Killerwatt hovered in the center of the space, a seething mass of electricity that hurt to look at. Egon crouched behind a makeshift barricade of equipment, his face tight with concentration as he fiddled with a tangle of wires. "Now!" Ray yelled, and they opened fire, the proton streams sizzling through the air. Killerwatt shrieked, a sound like tearing metal, and lashed out with tendrils of lightning. Sparks flew as the Ghostbusters ducked and dodged, trying to keep their beams trained on the writhing specter. But Killerwatt was too fast, too slippery. He darted and wove between the streams, laughing all the while. And then, with a triumphant howl, he dove straight for Egon, electricity crackling around him like a hellish aura. Time seemed to slow down. Ray saw Egon look up, his eyes widening behind his cracked glasses. Saw Peter lunge forward, throwing himself between the ghost and his friend. Saw the bolt of lightning strike Peter square in the chest, lifting him off his feet and slamming him back against the wall. Ray screamed. Or maybe it was Winston. He couldn't tell over the roaring in his ears. All he knew was that Peter was down, his proton pack smoking and sparking, and Killerwatt was bearing down on Egon, ready to finish the job. And then Egon threw the switch. The capacitor hummed to life, the wires around it glowing white-hot. And Killerwatt froze, his jagged mouth opening in what might have been surprise. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the ghost began to shake, his edges blurring and distorting. Tendrils of energy snaked out from his body, faster and faster, drawn inexorably towards the capacitor. He shrieked again, a sound of pure, animal terror, and Ray felt a fierce surge of satisfaction. "It's working," he shouted, barely able to hear himself over the building whine of the machine. "Pour it on, Egon." Egon cranked a dial, his face set in a rictus of determination. The capacitor thrummed, the wires around it vibrating like plucked guitar strings. And Killerwatt exploded. It was like watching a supernova in miniature. A blinding flash of light, a roar that shook the building down to its foundations. Ray threw up an arm to shield his eyes, squinting against the glare. When the spots cleared from his vision, Killerwatt was gone. Nothing left but a faint scorch mark on the floor and the acrid stench of ozone. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Winston broke the silence, his voice hoarse. "Peter?" They rushed to their fallen comrade's side, Egon already yanking open the medical kit. Peter lay crumpled against the wall, his eyes closed, his face pale beneath the soot. For one horrible second, Ray thought they were too late. Then Peter coughed, his eyelids fluttering. "Ugh, who let Slimer cook breakfast?" Ray felt a laugh bubble up in his chest, edged with hysteria. "You scared the hell out of us, Venkman." "Hey, it's not my fault Sparky there can't take a joke." Peter struggled to sit up, wincing. "Did we get him?" Egon nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief. "We got him. The capacitor worked perfectly." "Of course it did, you built it." Peter hauled himself to his feet, swaying slightly. "Now let's get out of here before the EPA shows up to yell at us about proper ghost disposal protocol." As they limped back to the Ecto-1, Ray felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and elation. They'd done it. Against all odds, they'd stopped Killerwatt and saved the city from a fate worse than death. Sure, they were bruised and battered, their equipment held together with duct tape and a prayer. but they were alive. They were together. And really, what more could a Ghostbuster ask for? Ray climbed into the driver's seat, meeting each of his teammates' eyes in turn. In Winston's steady gaze, Egon's quiet pride, Peter's irreverent grin, he saw everything that made them who they were. A family. A team. Heroes. He gunned the engine, the Ecto-1's siren wailing to life. "Let's go home, boys. I think we've earned a break." And with that, they roared off into the night, leaving the dark specter of Killerwatt behind them. The city might need them again tomorrow, or the day after that. But for now, they had each other. And that was enough. Chapter 5. The abandoned power plant loomed before them like a slumbering beast, its rusted towers and crumbling walls silhouetted against the unnaturally dark sky. As the Ecto-1 rumbled to a stop, the headlights illuminated the decrepit structure in an eerie glow. Ray killed the engine, and the sudden silence was heavy with foreboding, broken only by the whisper of wind through shattered windows. Winston leaned forward, peering through the cracked windshield at the ominous scene before them. "I don't like this," he murmured, his eyes scanning the inky shadows that seemed to seep from every crevice. "It's too quiet, like the whole world is holding its breath." In the passenger seat, Egon fiddled with his PKE meter, his brow furrowed in concentration. The device emitted a series of erratic beeps, its needle twitching wildly as if possessed by an unseen force. "Killerwatt is here, all right," Egon confirmed, his voice tight with tension. "And he's stronger than ever. The psychokinetic energy readings are off the charts." "Well, isn't that just peaky?" Peter drawled from the back seat, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on his proton pack. "The sooner we zap this creep, the sooner I can get back to my regularly scheduled beauty sleep. These dark circles aren't going to fix themselves, you know." Ray shot him a look in the rearview mirror, but he couldn't help the small smile that tied to the corner of his mouth. Leave it to Peter to crack wise in the face of mortal danger. Egon adjusted his glasses, the lenses reflecting the sickly green glow of the PKE meter. "We need to be careful. Killerwatt has had time to grow in strength, feeding off the city's power grid. He won't be easily contained." "So what's the plan, fearless leader?" Peter asked, turning to Ray. "We just go sit here all night, or we actually gotta do something about this floating light bulb?" Ray took a deep breath, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We go in, set up the trap, and take Killerwatt down, no matter what it takes." He met each of their gazes in turn, seeing the determination etched on their faces. "This isn't just another bust, guys. This is a last stand. If we don't stop him here and now, the whole city could go dark permanently." A heavy silence descended over the car, each man acutely aware of the weight of responsibility that rested on their shoulders. Then Winston reached out and clapped Ray on the shoulder, his touch a reassuring anchor in the darkness. "We're with you, Ray, all the way." Peter nodded, a rare sincerity in his voice. "Yeah, what he said. Now let's go kick some ghostly ass." They climbed out of the Ecto-1, proton packs humming to life as they approached the gaping maw of the power plant's entrance. The air was thick with the stench of ozone and decay, and each breath felt like inhaling liquid fear. Ray could feel the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end, every instinct screaming at him to turn back, to flee from this place of darkness and despair. But he pushed forward, his resolve hardened by the knowledge that the fate of the city rested in their hands. They were the Ghostbusters, the last line of defense against the things that went bump in the night. And they would not back down, no matter the cost. Egon took point, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the gloom as they picked their way across the rubble-strewn floor. Shadows danced at the edges of the light, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe with a malevolent intelligence. Ray tried to ignore the growing sense of unease that coiled in his gut, focusing instead on the steady thump of his heartbeat in his ears. "There," Egon whispered, pointing to a cavernous chamber at the heart of the plant. "That's where we'll set up the trap, Ray. Winston, you're with me. Peter, you're on lookout duty." Peter sketched a sarcastic salute. "Aye, aye, Captain. I'll just be over here. Try not to die." As the trio set to work rigging up the makeshift capacitor, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The shadows seemed to press in closer, as if alive with malevolent intent. Sweat trickled down his spine, despite the chill in the air, and every creak of metal set his nerves jangling like lathe wires. Suddenly, a bone-chilling laugh echoed through the chamber, rattling the rusted catwalks and sending shivers down Ray's spine. He whirled around, proton wand at the ready, his heart hammering against his ribs, but there was nothing there. Only the endless dark and the whisper of his own ragged breathing. Guys?" Peter's voice crackled over the radio, tight with barely suppressed fear. "We've got company." No sooner had the words left his mouth than a blinding blast of lightning erupted from the darkness, narrowly missing Ray's head. The force of it sent him staggering back, spots dancing before his eyes as he struggled to regain his footing. And there, materializing out of the shadows like a nightmare-made flesh, was Killerwatt himself. The ghost's skeletal form crackled with stolen energy, his empty eye sockets blazing with an unholy light. Tendrils of electricity arced from his fingertips, scorching the air with the stench of ozone. "Now!" Egon yelled, slamming his fist down on the activation switch. The capacitor hummed to life, tendrils of electricity arcing between the hastily welded plates. For a moment, it seemed to be working. A Killerwatt reeled back, his form flickering like a candle in the wind. But then, with a bellowing roar that shook the foundations of the power plant, the ghost ripped free of the trap's pull. His power surged to new heights, the very air around him shimmering with heat as he drank in the capacitor's energy like a man dying of thirst. The Ghostbusters could only watch in horror as Killerwatt grew larger and more terrifying with each passing second, his laughter booming through the chamber like peals of thunder. Arcs of lightning danced around him, setting the walls ablaze and sending showers of sparks raining down on the team's heads. "It's not working!" Winston shouted over the howling winds that whipped through the chamber, tearing at their clothes and stinging their eyes. "He's too strong." Ray gritted his teeth, his mind racing like a hamster on a wheel. They'd thrown everything they had at this monster, poured every ounce of their skill and knowledge into the trap, and it still wasn't enough. What more could they do? How could they possibly hope to defeat an enemy that could turn the very power they relied on against them? And then, in a flash of desperate inspiration, it hit him. The solution had been staring them in the face all along. They just hadn't been crazy enough to see it. Chapter 6. "The grid!" Peter shouted incredulously, his voice nearly drowned out by the crackling of electricity in the air. He ducked instinctively as another searing bolt of lightning sizzled overhead, close enough that he could feel the heat singeing his hair. "Ray, if you finally lost it, we're trying to save the city, not fry it like an overcooked hot dog." But Ray was already in motion, his brow furrowed in concentration as his agile mind whirred with complex calculations. He waved away Peter's objections impatiently, his eyes alight with the thrill of scientific epiphany. "Don't you see? It all makes sense now. Killerwatt's been absorbing energy from the power grid this whole time, growing stronger with each substation he drains. If we can lure him to the central switching station and overload the system, it might be enough to short him out for good. Egon's eyes widened behind his red-rimmed glasses as the pieces fell into place. He nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of admiration and trepidation. Of course, a sudden surge of that magnitude would be like plugging Killerwatt into a cosmic light socket. The resulting feedback loop could theoretically disrupt his spectral energy matrix, but we'd need a massive amount of power to pull it off. "Leave that to me," Ray said grimly, his jaw set with determination. "I think I know where we can get it, but we'll have to move fast. The longer Killerwatt stays connected to the grid, the stronger he gets." He turned to fix Peter with a solemn stare, his normally jovial features shadowed with grim resolve. "And Peter, for this to work, we'll need bait, someone to keep Killerwatt occupied while we rig the trap." In the unnatural darkness that shrouded the central switching station, Peter couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he adjusted the straps of his proton pack for the umpteenth time. The heavy device felt like a lead weight on his back, a tangible reminder of the insane risk he was about to take. Around him, the cavernous space was filled with the hum of transformers and the acrid scent of ozone, an eerie blue glow emanating from the towering banks of circuit breakers and capacitors. "This is insane," Peter muttered under his breath, wiping away the beads of cold sweat that trickled down his forehead. "Leave it to Ray to come up with a plan that involves me playing ghost bait. If I get out of this alive, I'm charging him double for hazard pay." But deep down, beneath the layers of sarcasm and bravado, Peter knew it was their only shot. Killerwatt had proven too powerful, too cunning for a direct assault. The monstrous ghost seemed to anticipate their every move, striking with lightning speed and devastating force. The only way to stop him was to turn his own hunger for energy against him, and that meant giving the ghost a target he couldn't resist. Peter swallowed hard, his mouth dry as sandpaper, as he steeled himself for what was to come. He stepped forward into the eerie blue glow of the station's transformers, his proton thrower gripped tightly in sweat-slick hands. Behind him, Egon and Winston huddled nearby, ready to spring the trap at a moment's notice. And Ray was facing down the most daunting intellectual challenge of his career, racing against time to pull off a scientific miracle. Everything hinged on him now. "Hey, Killerwatt," Peter yelled, his voice echoing through the cavernous space with a bravado he didn't feel. "Looking for a late-night snack? Well, come and get it, you overgrown nightlight. I'm a 3-course meal of pure electrical deliciousness." For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence, broken by the relentless thrumming of the transformers. Peter's heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Had Killerwatt taken the bait? Or had the ghost seen through their ruse, leaving them exposed and vulnerable? Then, with a bone-rattling roar that shook the very foundations of the station, Killerwatt burst from the shadows, his form swollen to monstrous proportions. Arcs of lightning crackled across his translucent body, his eyes blazing with malevolent hunger. Peter yelped in terror and dove for cover behind a bank of capacitors as a blast of searing energy scorched the spot where he'd been standing a heartbeat before, leaving a smoking crater in the concrete. "Ain't now, Ray?" Peter screamed into his radio, his voice cracking with fear as he rolled to avoid another lightning strike that ripped through the air like a whip crack. "I'm about to become the world's crispiest Ghostbuster." Across the city, deep in the musty depths of an abandoned subway tunnel, Ray Stantz hunched over a tangle of wires and circuit boards, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he worked feverishly. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking through his jumpsuit, but he barely noticed. His mind was consumed by a dizzying array of equations and schematics, his hands moving with practiced speed as he spliced and soldered with single-minded focus. This was it, their last desperate gambit, to save the city from Killerwatt's reign of terror. If Ray couldn't find a way to channel the third rail's power into the switching station's grid, creating a massive electrical surge that would overload the Ghost like a blown fuse, then all was lost. The city would fall, plunged into an eternal night from which it might never recover. And his friends would pay the ultimate price for his failure. With a final, sparking connection, Ray sat back on his heels, his heart pounding like a jackhammer in his chest. It was done, a jury-rigged miracle of scientific improvisation that would either save the day or blow them all to kingdom come. Now, all he could do was pray that his desperate calculations had been correct, and that his friends could hold out long enough for his plan to work. "Okay, guys," Ray said into the radio, his voice steady despite the fear that clawed at his throat like icy talons. "It's all you now. I've done everything I can from here. Godspeed." Back at the switching station, Egon and Winston exchanged a grim nod of understanding. This was it, the moment of truth. As Peter continued his desperate dance with Killerwatt, diving and rolling to avoid the Ghost's relentless attacks, the two Ghostbusters crept towards the massive circuit breaker at the heart of the station. This was the linchpin of Ray's audacious plan, the point where they would feed the subway's crackling power into the city's grid, creating a massive electrical surge that would hopefully fry Killerwatt like a mosquito in a bug zapper. Egon's hands shook as he connected the leads, his brow furrowed in concentration. One wrong move, one misplaced connection, and they would all be reduced to piles of smoldering ash. Winston stood at his back, proton thrower held at the ready, his eyes flicking between Egon's work and Peter's increasingly desperate battle with the enraged Ghost. "Ready," Egon said at last, meeting Winston's gaze with a solemn nod. "On 3, 1, 2. But before he could utter the final count, Killerwatt whirled around with preternatural speed, his blazing eyes fixing on the two Ghostbusters with malevolent intent. The Ghost had sensed the trap, his inhuman cunning alerting him to the danger at the last possible second. With a howl of fury that shook the station to its very foundations, Killerwatt unleashed a bolt of writhing electrical energy that ripped through the air like a thunderbolt from the heavens. Time seemed too slow to a crawl, each heartbeat stretching into an eternity. Winston saw the crackling blast coming, saw the look of horrified realization dawning on Egon's sweat-streaked face. There was no time to think, no time to plan, no time for anything but the purest, most basic instinct. With a wordless shout of desperate defiance, Winston lunged forward, shoving Egon aside with every ounce of strength he possessed. The lanky scientist stumbled, tumbling to the ground in a tangle of limbs as Killerwatt's searing attack ripped through the space he had occupied a heartbeat before. But Winston had no time to evade the strike. The bolt of pure electrical energy slammed into his chest with the force of a runaway train, lifted him off his feet, and sent him hurtling backwards through the air like a rag doll. White-hot agony exploded through every nerve, every cell of his body, a searing, unbearable torment that went beyond anything he had ever known. The world exploded in a blinding flash of searing light, and then went black, as oblivion claimed him at last. Chapter 7. Ray Stantz had faced down all manner of supernatural horrors in his time with the Ghostbusters, the rampaging gods, interdimensional demons, even the occasional boogeyman under the bed. But nothing could have prepared him for the icy fist of fear that clenched around his heart as Winston's scream tore through the crackling static of the radio. Ray's hands shook as he gripped the radio, his knuckles white. The musty smell of old books and burnt circuitry filled his nostrils as he stood frozen amidst the cluttered chaos of the Ghostbusters headquarters. Dread pooled in his stomach, cold and heavy. "Winston," he shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "Egon, Peter, somebody talk to me. What's happening?" Ray's mind raced with horrible possibilities as the seconds ticked by with agonizing slowness. Images of his friend lying broken and lifeless flashed before his eyes. "Please, not Winston," he prayed silently. "Not like this." For a long, terrifying moment, there was only silence, broken by the hiss and pop of the radio static. Ray hardly dared to breathe. Then Egon's voice, shaky but determined, cut through the white noise. "Winston's down," Egon reported, his words clipped and tense. Ray could picture him in the dimly lit station, jaw clenched as he delivered the grim news. Killerwatt got him, but the surge is ready, Ray. We need that power now." Ray swallowed hard, closing his eyes for a moment as he absorbed the blow. He felt numb, disconnected, as if this were all a terrible dream. But the urgency in Egon's voice cut through his daze, spurring him to action. Moving as if in a trance, Ray made his way to the bank of machinery along the wall. The familiar hum and glow of the equipment was almost comforting, a reminder of the countless hours he had spent tinkering and inventing. But now, as his fingers hovered over the switch, he was acutely aware of the weight of the moment. This was it. The point of no return. If the surge didn't work, if they couldn't stop Killerwatt. Ray shook his head, banishing the dark thoughts. He couldn't afford to think like that. Too much was at stake. Ray took a deep breath, the stale, electric-charged air filling his lungs. He sent up a silent prayer to whatever gods might be listening. Please, he thought, let this work. Let it all be worth it. Let Winston be okay. With that final, desperate plea, Ray threw the switch. There was a deep, resonant thunk, and then a low, rising whine as the machinery came to life. Indicator lights flashed and dials spun as raw power surged through the cables. Across the city, the lights flickered and died as the surge tore through the power grid like a tidal wave. In homes and offices, on streets and subways, the darkness was total and absolute. Confused citizens looked up from their TVs and computer screens, blinking in the sudden blackness. A chorus of car alarms and shouts of consternation filled the night. And at the heart of it all, in the eerie blue glow of the switching station, Killerwatt howled in agony as the surge ripped through his ectoplasmic form. The ghost swelled to monstrous size, his electric blue outline fracturing and splintering as he struggled to contain the massive influx of energy. Peter and Egon stared up at the riding specter, their faces bathed in the ethereal light. They clutched their proton packs with white-knuckled grips, eyes wide with mingled awe and terror as Killerwatt convulsed and shrieked above them. The ghost's cries rose to a deafening crescendo, the sound seeming to vibrate in their very bones. And then, with a final, ear-splitting crack, Killerwatt exploded in a blinding flash of light. The shock waves slammed into the Ghostbusters like a physical blow, lifting them off their feet and sending them flying. They crashed to the hard concrete floor in a tangle of limbs and proton packs, the breath knocked from their lungs. For a long moment, they lay stunned, ears ringing, and spots dancing before their eyes. The acrid stench of burnt ozone hung heavy in the air. Slowly, painfully, they disentangled themselves and struggled to sit up, wincing at the new collection of bruises and scrapes. Peter was the first to find his voice. Is it over?" he asked hoarsely, hardly daring to hope. Egon fumbled for his PKE meter with shaking hands, the display casting a sickly green glow over his angular features. His eyes darted back and forth as he analyzed the readings, brow furrowed in concentration. "The readings are minimal," he reported at last, relief and exhaustion warring in his tone. "Killerwatt, I think we got him." But their elation was short-lived, as their eyes fell on Winston's crumpled form, lying ominously still against the far wall. A smear of red marred the concrete behind his head. "Winston!" Peter cried, scrambling to his feet. He half ran, half stumbled to his friend's side, falling to his knees beside him. Egon was only a step behind, his face pale and drawn. "Come on, buddy, don't do this to us," Peter pleaded, his voice choked with fear as he cradled Winston's head in his lap. "Wake up!" With a trembling hand, Egon checked for a pulse, hardly breathing. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, there was only a terrible, yawning silence. Then, miracle of miracles, Winston stirred. His eyelids fluttered, and he let out a low groan, his face contorting in pain. Did we get him?" he asked weakly, his voice a thready whisper. Egon let out a shaky laugh, relief flooding his face. "Yeah, Winston, we got him. Just hold on, okay?" Minutes later, Ray burst into the station, his face haggard and streaked with soot. He skidded to a halt, eyes widening as he took in the scene, the scorched and shattered equipment, the lingering stench of burnt ectoplasm, and his friends huddled around Winston's prone form. "Winston!" Ray hurried over and dropped to his knees beside the others. Tears welled in his eyes as he took Winston's hand, swallowing hard around the lump in his throat. "You stupid, brave son of a gun," he said roughly. "Don't ever scare us like that again." Winston managed a faint smile. "No promises," he whispered. Then his eyes rolled back, and he went limp, his head lolling against Peter's chest. "We need to get him to a hospital," Egon said grimly, checking Winston's pulse again. It was thready and weak, but still there. "Let's move." Together, moving with infinite care, they lifted Winston and carried him out of the darkened station. Around them, the city was slowly coming back to life, lights flickering on as the power grid rebooted itself. The comforting glow of civilization pushed back the darkness, banishing the shadows to the furthest corners. They had done it. Against all odds, against an enemy that had seemed invincible, they had saved the city. The people of New York would wake in the morning, never knowing how close they had come to being plunged into eternal night. But the Ghostbusters knew. And as they carefully loaded Winston into the back of the Ecto-1, battered and bruised but unbroken, they shared a look of solemn understanding. This was the burden they bore, the price they paid for being the thing that went bump in the night. Because that's what heroes do. And the Ghostbusters were the best damn heroes the world had ever seen. Chapter 8. The ride back to the firehouse was a blur for Ray, his mind still reeling from the night's events. They had beaten Killerwatt, saved the city from a blackout of apocalyptic proportions, but at what cost? He glanced over at Winston, slumped in the back seat with his head lolling against the window. Angry purple bruises marred the man's dark skin, a testament to the brutal hits he had endured. His chest rose and fell in shallow, labored breaths, each one seeming to take a tremendous effort. Ray winced, vividly recalling the moment Killerwatt had sent a crackling bolt of pure energy hurtling towards Egon. Time had seemed to slow, the air heavy with the stench of ozone. Winston, without hesitation, had hurled himself in front of Egon, taking the full brunt of the blast. The sickening crunch of his body slamming into the concrete still echoed in Ray's ears. It was the kind of selfless bravery that defined the Ghostbusters, the willingness to put it all on the line for each other. But as Ray watched Winston's eyelids flutter deliriously, a sheen of sweat glistening on the man's brow, a cold knot of dread settled in his gut. This wasn't like busting mischievous Class 3 vapors or wrangling slime-spewing gremlins. No, Killerwatt had been something else entirely. A primal force of nature, pure unbridled power given ghostly form. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and any one of them could have ended up a charred husk on that power plant floor. Ray swallowed hard, his gaze drifting to the others. Peter sat shotgun, dabbing at a crusted gash above his eyebrow with a crumpled fistful of fast food napkins. The normally immaculate hair hung lank with sweat, a smudge of ash across one cheek. In the driver's seat, Egon gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity, the sleeves of his jumpsuit pushed up to reveal the angry welts and blisters mottling his hands and forearms. The wounds of men who had quite literally grabbed lightning by the horns. As Ecto-1 pulled into the garage, the screech of tires against concrete snapping Ray out of his reverie, Janine was there to meet them. The shrill ring of the phone punctuated her clipped steps, her face pinched with worry. "Oh my God, what happened?" she asked, yanking open the rear door to help Winston. Her hands fluttered over his battered form, eyes widening at the extent of the damage. "Are you guys okay?" Peter waved her off with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, just another day at the office, busting ghosts, saving the world the usual." Janine rounded on him, jabbing a manicured nail into his chest. "Can the cutesy bullshit bank, man. I've been fielding calls from half the boroughs about the power outages. Con Ed's up my ass, the mayor's demanding answers. Hell, even the feds are sniffing around. So you better give me something to work with here." A heavy silence descended, broken only by the labored rasp of Winston's breathing. Finally, Egon spoke, his voice strained. "It's a long story, Janine, one that perhaps would best be saved for the morning, after we've all had a chance to rest and recuperate." Janine's eyes narrowed, but something in Egon's haunted expression must have convinced her. She sighed, looping an arm around Winston's waist and helping him towards the stairs. "Fine, but you boys look like something a dumpster fire spit out. I want the full story, unabridged and unfiltered, on my desk by noon tomorrow, Capich." "Capich," Ray echoed weakly, a reflexive chuckle bubbling in his throat. Trust Janine to cut right through the supernatural mumbo-jumbo and whip them back into a semblance of order. But as they half-carried, half-dragged Winston up to the bunkroom, the adrenaline began ebbing away, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Ray eased Winston onto the couch, wincing at the man's hiss of pain. In the harsh fluorescent light, the toll of the night was laid bare. Peter's jumpsuit hung in tatters, the gash on his forehead beginning to scab over. Egon gingerly flexed his hands, the blisters weeping clear fluid. And Winston, God, Winston. Every labored breath sounded like a sob, his face a rictus of agony. Ray couldn't meet their eyes, shame curdling in his gut. It had been his plan, his calculations. Overload Killerwatt, let the capacitors suck it dry. But the cost, Christ, he hadn't accounted for the cost. A hand on his shoulder startled him. Egon, brows creased in concern. "You did well tonight, Ray," he said quietly. We all did. Killerwatt was an unprecedented paranormal threat. By all logical assessments, we should not have walked away from that confrontation. Ray shook his head, the weight of it all pressing down on him like a physical thing. "Tell that to Winston," he mumbled, gaze fixed on a scorched hole in the carpet. "I tell him myself if the ugly mug wasn't catching some much-deserved Z's," Peter drawled, easing himself onto the arm of the sofa. His words were light, but there was a tightness around his eyes that betrayed the fear underneath. "Look, Ray, you can crunch the numbers 6 ways to Sunday, but at the end of the day, we all signed up for this. The proton packs, the bumps in the night, the whole shebang. And when the chips are down, when the fat lady's warming up in the wings, there's nobody I'd rather have watching my back than you knuckleheads." Something thick lodged in Ray's throat. He looked around the room at these men he'd come to call brothers. Beaten, battered, 1 foot in the grave, but still standing. Still fighting. And in that moment, the guilt began to recede, replaced by a swell of fierce, unshakable pride. They were the Ghostbusters, the lone line of defense between the city and the horrors that lurked in the shadows. They had stared into the abyss, into the crackle and hiss of 1,000 gigawatts of pure evil, and they had not blinked. The road ahead would be long. The scars, both physical and mental, would linger. But as Ray looked around at his friends, his team, one unassailable truth crystallized in his mind. Come hell or high voltage, they would face it together. Always. The phone began to ring again, shrill and insistent. Janine's voice drifted up from below, tight with barely contained frustration. Just another day at the office. Ray cracked a smile. "Well, boys," he said, wincing as he leveraged himself to his feet. "Duty calls. What do you say we show this city what the Ghostbusters are really made of?" Egon adjusted his glasses, eyes glinting. "I thought you'd never ask." And together, battered but unbroken, they descended into the fray once more. Chapter 9. The morning dawned gray and overcast, a fitting reflection of the somber mood that had settled over the firehouse. Ray woke from a restless sleep, his dreams haunted by visions of crackling electricity and ghostly laughter. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the patter of rain against the window and trying to shake off the lingering unease from the night before. With a sigh, he swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, wincing as his muscles protested. Every inch of him felt sore and battered, a reminder of the brutal battle with Killerwatt. He shuffled to the window and peered out at the dreary cityscape, watching rivulets of water snake down the glass. The firehouse was quiet as he made his way downstairs, the old wooden steps creaking beneath his feet. He rubbed the grit from his tired eyes, trying to blink away the cobwebs of exhaustion. As he neared the kitchen, the rich aroma of coffee wafted out to greet him, mingling with the low murmur of voices. Ray paused in the doorway, taking in the sight of the others already gathered around the table. Winston sat hunched over a mug of steaming coffee, his dark skin ashen and his eyes haunted. Janine stood behind him, gently holding an ice pack to the back of his neck, with a look of concern etched on her face. Her red hair was disheveled, as if she'd been running anxious hands through it all night. Egon was conspicuously absent, no doubt sequestered in his lab, poring over the data from their encounter with Killerwatt. Peter lounged against the counter, his normally insouciant expression clouded with worry as he watched Winston. "How's our walking wounded?" Ray asked, striving for a light tone as he stepped into the room. 4 pairs of eyes swiveled to him, expressions ranging from relief to wary appraisal. Winston cracked a wan smile, though it didn't quite chase the shadows from his eyes. "I've had worse," he said, his voice a sandpaper rasp. "Though I gotta say, getting zapped by a Class 7 is no picnic." "About that," a voice interjected from the doorway. Ray turned to see Egon framed in the entrance to the kitchen, a stack of printouts clutched in his hands and his brow deeply furrowed. He looked as if he hadn't slept at all, still wearing the same rumpled clothes from the night before. "I've been analyzing the data from our encounter with Killerwatt," Egon continued, crossing to the table and spreading the sheets out for them to see. "And I'm not entirely certain he was a Class 7 at all." A stunned silence settled over the room as they all stared at Egon in disbelief. Peter was the first to find his voice. "Come again," he said sharply. "Because I could have sworn we just went toe-to-toe with the Energizer Bunny from hell last night." Egon shook his head, jabbing a finger at the arcane swirl of graphs and numbers littering the printouts. "His PKE signatures, the level of power he was able to absorb and redirect. It's like nothing I'd ever seen before. If I didn't know better, I'd say Killerwatt was tapping into something beyond the normal spectral energy field." Ray felt a frisson of unease slither down his spine, raising goosebumps on his skin despite the cozy warmth of the kitchen. He leaned over Egon's shoulder, scanning the data with a growing sense of trepidation. "What are you saying, Egon?" he asked slowly. "That Killerwatt was something more than a ghost?" Egon sighed, his shoulders slumping as if under a sudden weight. "I'm not sure," he admitted, frustration evident in his tone. "But I do know that we can't afford to let our guard down. If there are more entities out there like Killerwatt, entities that can control and manipulate the very infrastructure of our city, we need to be prepared." A heavy, uneasy silence descended over the room as they each grappled with the implications of Egon's words. The realization was sobering, the idea that their hard-won victory over Killerwatt might have been merely the opening salvo in a much larger, much more dangerous battle. But before the full gravity of the situation could sink in, the shrill wail of the alarm klaxon split the air, jolting them out of their grim reverie. Janine leapt to her feet, the ice pack tumbling forgotten to the floor as she snatched up the phone. "Ghostbusters," she barked into the receiver, her voice taut with barely leashed urgency. The others watched her, poised on a knife's edge of tension. She nodded sharply, her expression darkening. "Yes, of course, they're on their way." The receiver slammed back into its cradle with a clatter that sounded like a gunshot in the charged silence. Janine turned to them, her eyes glinting with resolve against the pallor of her face. "We've got a live one, boys," she said grimly. "The Sedgwick Hotel sounds like a real nasty customer." For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. Ray felt the leaden weight of exhaustion and doubt pressing down on him, the still raw wounds of the previous night's battle throbbing in protest. Could they really dive right back into the fray so soon, with Winston still battered and the looming specter of Killerwatt's true nature hanging over their heads like the sword of Damocles? But then, as he looked around at the faces of his fellow Ghostbusters, Ray felt something shift inside him. In Egon's thoughtful frown, in Peter's devilish grin, in Winston's stoic determination despite the pain still etched across his features, he saw the unbreakable spirit that had made them New York's most unlikely heroes. They were the Ghostbusters. No matter what fresh hell awaited them out there in the gray, drizzling streets, they would face it the way they always did, together. "All right," Ray said, squaring his shoulders and reaching for his proton pack. "Let's roll." As they piled into the Ecto-1, sirens wailing and lights strobing off the slick, rain-slicked asphalt, Ray met each of their eyes in turn. In that brief, wordless exchange, he saw his own resolve and purpose mirrored back at him. No matter what horrors they faced, no matter what eldritch evils the city's shadows spawned, the Ghostbusters would stand against them. After all, that's what they were here for. So with Janine's somber salute at their backs, and the grim edifice of the firehouse receding behind them, the Ecto-1 roared out into the dismal morning to once more answer the call. And as the gray tendrils of mist swallowed the vehicle, obscuring it from view, a single thought crystallized in Ray's mind with icy certainty. The time had come to believe in ghosts again. Chapter 10. As the Ecto-1 screeched to a halt outside the looming stone facade of the Sedgwick Hotel, Ray felt a chill run down his spine despite the midday sun beating down on the pavement. The building seemed to cast an ominous shadow, its darkened windows staring out like soulless eyes. This place held memories, none of them pleasant. Ray's mind flashed back to their very first call as Ghostbusters, the nightmare-inducing encounter with the gluttonous green blob known as Slimer. He could still feel the ectoplasmic slime oozing down his neck, still smell the putrid stench that had permeated every inch of his jumpsuit. And then there was Gozer, the ancient Sumerian god who had chosen this very hotel as the site of its apocalyptic arrival. The image of a gargantuan stay, huffed marshmallow man rampaging through the streets of New York was seared into Ray's memory forever. Now, so soon after their draining battle with the electricity-hungry specter Killerwatt, it seemed as though the Sedgwick was once again destined to be the stage for another supernatural showdown. As Ray stepped out of the car, the weight of the proton pack on his back was both reassuring and worrying. He adjusted his grip on the Neutrona wand, flexing his fingers inside the heavy rubber gloves. "I got a bad feeling about this one, Egon," he muttered as the tall, bespectacled scientist emerged from the other side of the vehicle. "After what we just went through with Killerwatt, I don't know if I'm ready for another Class 5 or higher so soon." Egon's expression remained stoic, but there was a flicker of concern behind his wire-rimmed glasses. "Understandable, Raymond, but we've faced far worse odds before and prevailed. We must remain vigilant and trust in our training and equipment." He patted the PK meter clipped to his belt before striding towards the hotel entrance. As the team assembled in the opulent lobby, an eerie silence greeted them. The usual bustle of bellhops and concierges, the clinking of glasses and chatter of patrons, was conspicuously absent. Even their footsteps seemed to be swallowed up by the thick red carpet. The cavernous space felt more like a mausoleum than a five-star hotel, the grandeur of the crystal chandeliers and marble columns diminished by the heavy aura of foreboding that hung in the air. "Hello!" Peter called out, his voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Ghostbusters, at your service, anybody home?" He turned to the others with a shrug. "Guess we should have called ahead for reservations." Winston shot him an exasperated look. "Man, this ain't no time for jokes. I don't like how quiet it is in here." His fingers tightened around his particle thrower as his eyes darted around the deserted lobby. Egon was already scanning the area with his PKE meter, his brow furrowed in concentration. The device let out a series of shrill beeps and whines, its antennae glowing an ominous red. "I'm picking up some very strange readings," he said, his voice tight with tension. "Multiple Class 5 entities, possibly higher, but the signal is scattered, almost like they're masking their true nature." Ray felt his stomach drop as an icy dread crept up his spine. Masking their true nature, just like Killerwatt had done. Were they about to face another entity that could bend the rules of the spectral energy field, drawing power from sources beyond human comprehension? Before he could voice his fears, a bone-chilling scream ripped through the air. It seemed to be coming from the upper floors, a primal sound of pure, undiluted terror. The hairs on the back of Ray's neck stood straight up as goosebumps erupted along his arms. "Let's move," Winston barked, already charging towards the grand staircase. The others fell in step behind him, their boots pounding against the worn marble steps, proton packs humming with power as they readied themselves for battle. The screams grew louder as they approached the 12th floor, a discordant chorus of agony and fear that made Ray's blood run cold. He exchanged a grim nod with Peter, a moment of silent solidarity, before bracing his shoulder and slamming into the door of room 1210. The wood splintered and cracked as the door burst inward, revealing a scene straight out of a nightmare. In the center of the room, a woman hung suspended in midair, her limbs twisting and contorting as if pulled by invisible strings. Her face was frozen in a rictus of terror, eyes bulging and mouth stretched open in a silent scream. And swirling around her like wisps of smoke were at least a dozen ghostly figures, their translucent forms undulating and shifting in a macabre dance. "What the?" Peter breathed, his proton wand wavering slightly as he took in the surreal sight. Ray shook off his momentary paralysis, forcing himself to focus on the task at hand. "We have to save that woman. Egon, any idea what we're dealing with here?" But before Egon could respond, the spirits suddenly halted their mesmerizing movements. As one, they turned to face the Ghostbusters, their spectral visages darkening with malevolent intent. Ray felt a wave of raw fear wash over him as he stared into the glowing pits of the ghost's eyes, seeing nothing but hatred and hunger swirling in their ethereal depths. And then, with an unholy shriek that seemed to pierce straight through Ray's skull, they attacked. The spirits shot forward like bullets, their shadowy forms streaking through the air with unnatural speed and ferocity. Ray threw himself to the side just as a ghost swooped past, the chill of its ectoplasmic essence searing his skin even through his jumpsuit. The room erupted into chaos as proton streams sliced through the air, leaving scorch marks on the walls and reducing furniture to smoldering husks. But the ghosts were too quick, too agile, slipping between the beams of concentrated particles like wisps of smoke on the wind. "They're too fast," Winston shouted over the deafening whine of his proton pack. "We can't get a lock on them." Ray gritted his teeth, his mind racing for a solution. There had to be a way to slow the ghosts down, to make them more susceptible to the proton streams. Casting his gaze around the destroyed hotel room, his eyes fell upon the fire suppression sprinklers dotting the ceiling. A crazy, desperate plan began to form. "Egon," Ray yelled, gesturing frantically to the sprinkler system. "What if we use that to spray the ghosts with positively charged ions? It might disrupt their ectoplasmic cohesion long enough for us to trap them." A glimmer of understanding flashed across Egon's sweat-streaked face. Yes, of course, the spectral capacitance would be momentarily inverted by the ionic saturation. He started edging his way along the wall toward the control panel, keeping one eye on the swirling maelstrom of ghostly figures. "Whatever you're gonna do it fast," Peter shouted as he narrowly dodged a dive-bombing specter. "I don't know how much longer we can hold them off." Ray and Peter redoubled their efforts, their proton streams crisscrossing in a dazzling web of orange energy as they fought to keep the spirits at bay. Out of the corner of his eye, Ray saw Egon frantically punching codes into the control panel, his face a mask of intense concentration. The ghosts pressed their attack, their wails rising to a deafening crescendo that made Ray's skull feel like it was going to split open. He could feel the heat of their rage, the icy tendrils of their hatred coiling around his heart. For one terrifying moment, He was certain that this was the end, that they had finally met a supernatural foe beyond their abilities to vanquish. And then, with a hiss and a gurgle, the sprinklers sputtered to life. But instead of water, they sprayed out a fine mist of shimmering, crackling particles that filled the air with the sharp tang of ozone. The effect on the ghosts was immediate and dramatic. They recoiled as if struck, their ectoplasmic forms rippling and shuddering like reflections in a pond. "The trap now," Ray roared, seizing the opportunity. He snatched the foot-pedal-activated device from his belt and tossed it into the center of the room, praying it would slide into the optimal position. As the trap skittered across the floor, time seemed to slow to a crawl. Ray watched, heart in his throat, as the ghost struggled against the effects of the ionized mist. He could see the trap's doors slowly creaking open, the blinding white vortex beginning to spill out and pull at the weakened spirits. One by one, the ghosts were sucked down into the trap's swirling maw, their howls of rage and frustration fading into silence as they disappeared into the portable containment unit. And finally, with a resounding clang, the trap slammed shut, the indicator light blinking a steady red to signal a successful capture. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke, the only sound the harsh rasp of their labored breathing and the hiss of still sparking proton packs powering down. Ray stared at the smoking, battered trap in the middle of the decimated hotel room, hardly daring to believe that they had emerged victorious against such overwhelming odds. "Everyone all right?" Winston asked finally, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief. "Anybody need medical attention?" "I think we're good," Peter replied, holstering his neutrona wand with a shaky grin. "Although I might need therapy after this one. Those spooks were something else." Ray let out a breathless chuckle, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. "You can say that again. I've never seen ghosts move like that before. If it wasn't for Egon's quick thinking with the sprinklers, we might be the ones getting trapped right now." Egon pushed his glasses up his nose, his face still pale but composed. "It was your idea, Raymond. I merely implemented it." He knelt down to examine the trap, prodding at the blinking control panel. Fascinating, the PKE readings indicate a level of spectral energy unlike anything we've encountered before. I'll have to run some tests back at the lab to determine. His musings were cut short by a low groan from the corner of the room. The woman who had been trapped by the spirits was stirring, her eyes fluttering open as she struggled to sit up. Winston hurried to her side, helping her to her feet and supporting her weight as she swayed unsteadily. "Easy there, ma'am," he said gently. "You've been through quite an ordeal. We're gonna get you some medical attention, all right?" The woman nodded weakly, her gaze distant and haunted. What were those things?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've never seen anything like them before." Ray exchanged a troubled glance with his fellow Ghostbusters. It was a question they were all asking themselves. The ghosts they had just faced were unlike any they had tangled with before, their powers and abilities far beyond the norm. And the way they had targeted this specific woman, the sheer malevolence of their attack, it sent a chill down Ray's spine. "We're not sure," he admitted finally, trying to keep his tone reassuring. "But we're going to find out. That's our job, after all, to protect the people of this city from any and all supernatural threats." As they helped the shaken woman out of the ravaged hotel room and down to the waiting ambulance, Ray couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever dark forces were at work here, whatever nefarious entities were pulling the strings behind the scenes, he had a sinking suspicion that the Ghostbusters were in for the fight of their lives. But as he climbed back into the Ecto-1, the comforting weight of his proton pack resting against his back and the determined faces of his teammates beside him, Ray felt a flicker of hope amidst the dread. They had beaten the odds before, had stared down apocalyptic horrors, and lived to tell the tale. As long as they stood together, as long as they trusted in each other and the rightness of their cause, there was nothing they couldn't face. The Ecto-1's sirens wailed to life as they pulled away from the Sedgwick Hotel, ready to take on whatever ghostly menace awaited them next. For the Ghostbusters, the battle against the unknown never ended. And that was just the way they liked it. Chapter 11. The trap burst open with a blinding flash of white light, as if a miniature sun had ignited in the center of the room. The ghosts let out unearthly shrieks of fury and fear, their ethereal forms stretching and distorting as they were sucked inexorably into the trap's swirling vortex. Ray threw up an arm to shield his eyes from the searing brilliance, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck prickle and rise as the air crackled with psychokinetic energy. It felt like standing at the heart of an electrical storm, raw power lashing against his skin. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The trap snapped shut with a definitive metallic clang, its blinking LED lights cycling from angry red to a calm, steady green that indicated a successful capture. In the sudden, pressing silence that followed, the only sound was the heavy panting of the Ghostbusters as they stood drenched in sweat, eyes wide with lingering adrenaline. "Everybody okay?" Ray asked, wincing slightly at the tremor in his voice. His heart was still racing a mile a minute, blood roaring in his ears. "Define okay," Peter grumbled, reaching up to gingerly probe at an angry purple bruise blossoming across his cheekbone, a souvenir from when one of the ghosts had slammed him face first into the unforgiving brick wall. "I feel like I just went 10 rounds with Mike Tyson, and he didn't believe in taking breaks between punches." Egon had already dropped to his knees beside the prone form of the woman, who had crumpled bonelessly to the wooden floor the instant the ghost's malevolent hold on her was broken. His long, deft fingers found the pulse point at her neck, and some of the tension bled out of his shoulders. "She's alive," he pronounced, his voice clinical but not without sympathy. "Just unconscious for the moment, probably a result of the intense psychic trauma she endured." Winston reholstered his proton gun and surveyed the scene of destruction with a grim set to his jaw. Shattered glass glittered in drifts across the floor, crunching under his boots as he moved to join the others. "What the hell were those things, Egon?" he demanded, a rare note of open unease in the normally unflappable man's tone. "I've been bustin' ghosts with you guys for a while now, but I ain't never seen spooks move like that before." "I'm not sure," Egon admitted, his brow furrowed in intense thought as he absently pushed his glasses back up the bridge of his nose. "But I have a working theory. The way they were able to mask their PKE signatures until the last moment, the level of coordination and intelligence they display, almost like a pack of predators, I think we may be dealing with an entirely new classification of entity altogether." Ray felt a deep chill settle into his bones at Egon's words, a freesaw of unease coiling up his spine. A new kind of entity, never before seen by mortal man. Just like Killerwatt had been. It couldn't be a mere coincidence that two such unprecedentedly powerful and menacing manifestations would appear in such close succession. He didn't believe in coincidences, not in their line of work. Something was happening, something momentous and deeply troubling. Before he could gather his racing thoughts enough to voice his growing sense of foreboding aloud, a flicker of movement caught his eye. The woman was stirring back to wakefulness, her lashes fluttering open to reveal dazed, haunted eyes that darted wildly about the room without truly seeing. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she struggled to sit up, only to slump back with a low moan. "Hey, easy there, it's okay," Ray soothed, kneeling down beside her and reaching out to rest what he hoped was a reassuring hand on her shoulder. The fabric of her blouse was clammy with cold sweat under his palm. "You're safe now, I promise. The ghosts are gone, locked up tight. They can't hurt you anymore." The woman shook her head emphatically, tendrils of lank hair clinging to her ashen face. When she spoke, her voice emerged as a thready, trembling whisper, as if she barely had the strength to force the words out. "You don't understand, they spoke to me inside my mind." That drew Egon's piercing, intent focus at once, his eyes sharpening behind the lenses of his glasses as he leaned in closer. "What did they say to you, can you remember?" The woman swallowed convulsively, her throat working as she visibly struggled to gather the tattered shreds of her courage. "They said they were only the beginning," she managed at last, each word a battle-hard one. "That more like them were coming, so many more, that the walls between worlds were growing thin, the veil shredding like old lace, and soon the dead would rise and walk the earth again." A leaden, breathless hush fell over the room in the wake of her chilling pronouncement, the air itself seeming to congeal and thicken with dread. Ray could see the same horrified realization settling across the faces of his fellow Ghostbusters, the unspoken acknowledgement of just how far and over their heads they might be this time. He felt it too, the icy fist of real fear closing around his hammering heart, squeezing until he was sure it would simply burst within his chest. "Egon," he said urgently, fighting to keep his voice level and unmoved even as it wanted to tremble and crack like brittle glass. "If she's right about this, if it's all connected somehow." "I know," Egon said grimly, his angular features drawn and pale in the wan light filtering through the grime-streaked windows. "We need to return to headquarters immediately and begin analyzing the data from our PKE meters. If there is a larger pattern here, a common thread linking these manifestations, we have to uncover it, and quickly." "Ah, Simon, guys, lighten up a little," Peter interjected with a jarring note of forced levity, reaching out to clap a bracing hand on Ray's shoulder. But for all his usual glibness, there was a telltale tightness at the corners of his eyes, a grim set to his mouth that belied his casual words. "We've gone toe-to-toe with way nastier customers than these two big Caspers and come out on top, haven't we? We took down freaking Gozer the Gozerian. We stopped that smarmy art snob Vigo from pulling his body-snatching shtick at the museum. We've got this handled, no problem." But even as he spoke, Ray couldn't miss the flicker of doubt, the seed of real uncertainty taking root behind Peter's devil-may-care facade. The unspoken, gnawing fear that this time they may well have finally found a threat beyond their ability to conquer. The heavy sense of foreboding lingered, casting a pall over the atmosphere as they made their way back out to where Ecto-1 awaited them at the curb. The woman's ominous words seemed to echo in the hushed stillness of the empty street, reverberating in Ray's ears like the tolling of a funeral bell. The dead would walk again, and the Ghostbusters would be the last and only line of defense standing between the world of the living and a rising tide of ravenous, vengeful dead. Chapter 12. The mood was somber as they drove back to the firehouse, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Ray stared out the window, watching the city flash by in a blur of concrete and glass. It was hard to believe that just a few hours ago, he had woken up thinking the worst was behind them, that their victory over Killerwatt had bought them some much-needed breathing room. The morning sun had streamed through the blinds of his cramped bedroom at the firehouse, coaxing him awake with its gentle warmth. He stretched and yawned, feeling a lightness in his chest that had been absent for weeks. Rolling out of bed, he padded over to the window and gazed out at the bustling streets below, already filling with morning traffic. The city felt alive again, pulsing with energy and purpose after the terror of the blackouts. We did it, he murmured to himself, a grin spreading across his face. We beat that electric monstrosity. The city's safe again, thanks to us. Whistling a Johnny tune, he headed downstairs, the smell of freshly brewed coffee guiding him to the kitchen. Egon was already there, hunched over a spread of PKE meter printouts and scribbling furiously in a notebook. "Morning, Egon," Ray said brightly, pouring himself a steaming mug. "Sleep well?" Egon glanced up, blinking owlishly behind his glasses. "Sleep? Oh, yes, I suppose I did manage a few hours. But Ray, look at these readings from last night. The residual PKE levels are like nothing we've ever seen before. I'm not entirely convinced we've seen the last of Killerwatt." Ray's grin faded as he leaned over Egon's shoulder, scanning the jagged lines and spiking numbers. A chill ran down his spine, a flicker of unease dousing his good mood. "You think it survived somehow, even after we crossed the streams?" "I don't know," Egon admitted, rubbing his eyes. "But I think we need to stay vigilant. This entity was unlike anything in our database. We may be dealing with a new class of ghost altogether." How naive that seemed now, in the face of what they had just witnessed at the Sedgwick. A new kind of entity, one that could mask its true nature and bend minds to its will. And if the woman's warning was to be believed, it was just the beginning. The call had come in just after 10, Janine's voice tight with urgency over the radio. "Guys, we've got a situation at the Sedgwick Hotel, reports of guests acting strangely, possible possession. You better get over there pronto." They had suited up in record time, piling into the Ecto-1 with a squeal of tires. Peter took the wheel, weaving through midday traffic with a manic glint in his eye. "Sedgwick Hotel, huh?" he said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Why does that ring a bell?" "It's where we had our first major bust," Ray reminded him. "The Class 5 free roaming vapor, remember?" "Slimer," Winston chuckled. "How could I forget that nasty little spud? Covered me in ectoplasmic goo." But as they pulled up to the hotel's grand entrance, it was clear this was no mere repeat haunting. Screams echoed from inside, guests running out in terror, their faces twisted in fear. The Ghostbusters exchanged grim looks as they grabbed their proton packs and headed in. The lobby was in chaos, furniture overturned and bellhops cowering behind the front desk. A woman in a maid's uniform stood in the center of the destruction, her eyes glowing an eerie green. She turned to face them, her movements jerky and unnatural. "You're too late," she hissed, her voice layered with an otherworldly echo. "We are Legion, we are everywhere, and we will not be contained." Before they could react, she threw her head back in a silent scream, a blinding light erupting from her mouth and eyes. The Ghostbusters shielded their faces, proton wands at the ready, but as quickly as it had appeared, the light vanished, and the woman crumpled to the floor, unconscious. Egon rushed forward, PKE meter in hand, the antennae quivering wildly. "These readings, they're off the charts, but I'm not detecting any spectral entities. It's as if the possessing force just disappeared." "Disappeared?" Winston frowned. "How's that possible? Ghosts don't just vanish into thin air." "Apparently this one did," Peter said, holstering his particle thrower. "But did you hear what she said? We are Legion, we are everywhere. I don't like the sound of that." "Neither do I," Ray murmured, a cold knot of dread settling in his gut. "I think this was just a warning, a preview of what's to come." As they pulled into the garage, Ray's eyes fell on the containment unit, the towering red cylinder that held all the ghosts they had ever captured. It had always been a source of both pride and unease for him. a tangible reminder of all the good they had done, and all the potential for catastrophe they held in their hands. What would happen, he wondered, if something were to breach the containment unit? If all those malevolent spirits were to be set free at once, unleashed upon an unsuspecting city? The thought made his blood run cold. He pictured it in vivid detail, the klaxons blaring, the containment field flickering and failing, spectral forms pouring out in a tsunami of ectoplasmic energy. They would swarm the streets, possessing people by the thousands, turning the city into a nightmarish hellscape. And at the center of it all, laughing with malevolent glee, would be the entity from the Sedgwick, the one that had proclaimed itself Legion. Ray shuddered, the vision sending icy fingers down his spine. He couldn't let that happen. They couldn't let that happen. Whatever this new threat was, whatever it wanted, they had to stop it. The fate of the city depended on it. Ray? Egon's voice snapped him out of his reverie. You coming? Ray shook himself, forcing a smile as he climbed out of the car. Yeah, sorry, just thinking. He followed Egon inside, the scent of coffee and Janine's perfume mingling in the air, a comforting familiarity that grounded him. Winston and Peter were already in the kitchen, Peter regaling Janine with a dramatically embellished retelling of the Sedgwick incident. And then the old lady's head spun around and she started spewing pea soup all over the place, Peter said, waving his arms for emphasis. I'm telling you, Janine, it was like something out of The Exorcist. Sounds terrifying, Janine said dryly, sipping her coffee. Thank goodness you were there to save the day with your rapier wit and devastating good looks. Exactly. Peter grinned, either missing or ignoring the sarcasm. It's a dirty job, but someone's gotta do it, right, Ray? Ray managed a weak chuckle, but his mind was still churning with dark possibilities. He turned to Egon, lowering his voice. Egon, what do you make of what happened at the Sedgwick, that entity, the way it just disappeared? Have you ever seen anything like it? Egon frowned, pushing his glasses up his nose. No, I haven't. And that's what worries me. An entity capable of possession, of masking its PKE signature, of seemingly vanishing at will, it's beyond anything we've encountered before. I fear we may be facing a threat of near-apocalyptic proportions. A heavy silence fell over the group as the gravity of Egon's words sank in. Ray could see the same fear he felt reflected in his friend's eyes, the realization that they were treading in uncharted waters, facing an enemy they couldn't yet comprehend. But beneath the fear, there was also a steely determination, a resolve born of years of facing the impossible. They were the Ghostbusters. They didn't run from threats, they charged towards them, proton packs blazing. All right, Peter said at last, clapping his hands together. So we've got a new big bad in town, a ghost that thinks it's Legion. Well, I say bring it on. We've faced down ancient Sumerian gods, giant marshmallow men, and a literal river of slime. We can handle one more spook with delusions of grandeur. Peter's right, Winston said, standing tall. We've been through worse, we'll figure this out, just like we always do, but we gotta stick together, watch each other's backs, can't let this thing get in our heads. Ray felt a surge of affection for his friends, a warmth that chased away the pervasive chill of dread. Winston was right. They had to stay united, trust in each other, and in the bonds they'd forged through countless battles. Okay, he said, squaring his shoulders. First things first, Egon. You and I will hit the books, comb through every scrap of paranormal lore we can find. If there's any record of an entity like this, any clue to its weaknesses, we need to find it. Egon nodded, already heading for the stairs. I'll cross-reference the PKE readings with our database, see if I can find any spectral matches or common denominators. In the meantime, Ray continued, turning to Peter and Winston, you two hit the streets, shake down your contacts, follow up any leads, no matter how thin. If this thing really is everywhere, someone's gotta have seen something. On it, Peter said, grabbing his jacket. I've got a few friends down in Chinatown who might be able to shed some light, figuratively speaking, of course. And I'll check in with my old army buddies, Winston said. Some of them have had run-ins with the paranormal before. Maybe they've heard something through the grapevine. As they headed out, Ray felt a flicker of hope amid the pervading unease. They had a plan, a direction, a united front against the looming darkness. It was more than they'd had this morning, waking up to a false sense of peace. But as he climbed the stairs to the lab, the containment unit looming in his peripheral vision, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were racing against an unseen clock, that the entity's final words held a chilling promise. We are Legion. We are everywhere. And we will not be contained. They would find a way to stop it. They had to. The fate of the city, and possibly the world, depended on it. Chapter 13. The hours bled into days as Ray and Egon pored over the data, searching for any scrap of information that might shed light on the new entities they faced. They worked in shifts, catching snatches of sleep when they could, fueled by an endless stream of bitter coffee and a grim determination to unravel the mystery before it was too late. The lab was a chaotic mess of papers, empty takeout containers, and humming equipment. Ray rubbed his bleary eyes, squinting at the rows of numbers and graphs that danced across the computer screen. His back ached from hunching over the keyboard, and his fingers were stained with ink from scribbling notes and equations. Across the room, Egon looked equally haggard, his hair standing up at odd angles from running his hands through it in frustration. But no matter how hard they worked, how many calculations they ran, the picture only became more unsettling. Ray felt like they were trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle in the dark, the pieces stubbornly refusing to fit together. The PKE readings from the Sedgwick, when cross-referenced with those from the Killerwatt incident, painted a chilling picture. The spikes and dips formed a jagged mountain range of data points that hinted at something big, something world-changing simmering just out of reach. Look at this, Egon said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. He stabbed a long finger at a particularly jarring spike in the data, the green line searing itself into Ray's retinas. This energy signature, it's unlike anything we've ever seen. The harmonic frequencies are all wrong. The valence levels are off the charts. It's almost as if these entities are drawing power from somewhere else, somewhere beyond. A chill ran down Ray's spine, the hairs on the back of his neck standing at attention. He swallowed around the lump of dread in his throat. The woman at the Sedgwick, she said the veil between worlds was thinning, her eyes. I've never seen such certainty, such conviction, you don't think? He let the question hang in the air between them, almost afraid to give voice to the terrifying possibility. But Egon, ever the scientist, refused to shy away from the implications. He removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. When he looked up, his eyes were haunted. It's a possibility we can't ignore, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. If there is a breach between our world and the spectral plane, if these entities are somehow able to cross over at will, the consequences could be catastrophic. We're talking about a complete breakdown of the barriers that separate the living from the dead. Ray's hands shook as he ran them through his tangled hair. His mind raced with the implications, each thought more terrifying than the last. He pictured hordes of ghosts spilling into the streets, the sky turning black as the dead outnumbered the living. He imagined the wails of the damned drowning out the sounds of the city, the stench of decay choking the air. It was a waking nightmare, the kind of scenario that kept him up at night, drenched in cold sweat. And yet, as he stared at the data scrolling across the screen, the numbers blurring together into a mocking parade of inevitability, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was all too real, that the nightmare was just beginning. As if on cue, the phone rang, the shrill sound slicing through the tense silence of the lab like a scalpel. Ray jumped, his heart slamming against his ribcage as he lunged for the receiver. "Ghostbusters," he barked, not bothering to disguise the tremor in his voice. "How can we help you?" The voice on the other end was barely coherent, the words tripping over each other in a panicked jumble. "Please, you have to come quickly, it's everywhere. The ghosts, oh God, they're everywhere." There was a crash, a scream, and then the line went dead. Ray slammed the phone down, his blood turning to ice water in his veins. "Egon, we've got to move," he said, already reaching for his proton pack with shaking hands. "Sounds like a major manifestation, multiple entities, could be related to what we've been seeing." Egon nodded grimly, grabbing his own gear with a determined set to his jaw. "I'll call Peter and Winston, have them meet us there." His voice was steady, but Ray could see the fear in his friend's eyes, the knowledge of what they were about to face. As they raced to the Ecto-1, the sirens screaming into the night and the lights painting the streets red and blue, Ray felt a sinking sense of dread settle over him like a shroud. His stomach churned with acid, and his heart pounded a staccato rhythm against his chest. Whatever horrors lay in wait, whatever nightmares they were about to confront, he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The beginning of the end. Chapter 14. The address led them to a nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a hulking structure of corrugated metal and crumbling brick. As the Ecto-1 screeched to a halt outside, Ray could already feel the crackle of psychokinetic energy in the air, a static charge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He stepped out of the iconic vehicle, his boots crunching on the gravel strewn across the weed-choked parking lot. The night was moonless, the sky above a starless void that seemed to press down upon them like a smothering weight. "This is bad," Egon said, his PKE meter already out and scanning, its antennae twitching and dancing in response to unseen energies. His brow was furrowed in concentration, the ghostly glow of the device's screen casting harsh shadows across his angular features. "The readings are off the scale, whatever's in there, it's big." As if in response, a gust of frigid wind howled through the lot, carrying with it the faint, mournful wail of distant screams. Ray shivered, though whether from the cold or the eerie sound, he couldn't say. The crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of Peter and Winston, the beams of Peter's battered old Volvo cutting through the gloom. The two men climbed out, their faces grim and lined with tension as they strapped on their proton packs. "We came as fast as we could," Winston said, his deep voice steady despite the tightness around his eyes. "What's the situation?" Ray swallowed hard, his mouth suddenly bone dry. "Multiple entities, high PKE levels," he managed, his voice sounding thin and reedy to his own ears. "And I think it might be connected to what we've been seeing, the new manifestations, the thinning of the veil." He trailed off, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. They had all felt it, the growing sense of unease, the whispers of something dark and ancient stirring in the shadows. But to hear it spoken aloud, to confront the possibility head-on, it was enough to send a shiver down even the most hardened spine. Peter's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine fear passing behind his usually irreverent facade. Wait, hold up, or are you saying this could be it? The big one? Ray exchanged a look with Egon, a silent moment of understanding passing between them. They had both been thinking it, both been dreading the possibility. But now, faced with the undeniable evidence of their sensors, there was no denying it any longer. It's a distinct possibility, Egon said gravely, his voice as solemn as a funeral dirge. The energy readings, the scale of the manifestation, it's unlike anything we've ever encountered before. If there is a breach between worlds, a thinning of the barriers that separate the living from the dead, this could be the point of no return. A heavy silence fell over the group, each of them absorbing the gravity of the situation. They had faced apocalyptic threats before, stared down the end of the world, and lived to tell the tale. But this felt different. More primal, more terrifying in its scope and implications. Ray could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, a lead knot of dread coiling in the pit of his stomach. He looked to his friends, saw the same grim determination etched into their faces. They were all scared, all acutely aware of the stakes. But they were Ghostbusters. This was what they did. What they had to do. "Okay," Peter said at last, breaking the silence, his voice tight with forced levity. "So what's the plan? We can't just go charging in there half-cocked." "Agreed," Egon said, the glow of his PKE meter casting his face in stark relief. "We need to approach this carefully, systematically, establish a perimeter, take readings, try to get a sense of what we're dealing with before we engage." Ray nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Right, Peter, you and Winston circle around back. See if you can find another point of entry, Egon, and I will take the front. Start scanning for any sign of the entities." They split up, moving with practiced efficiency born of countless busts together. As Ray and Egon approached the rusted doors of the warehouse, proton packs thrumming with barely contained power, Ray could feel his heart pounding in his chest, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to flee from the unseen horror that awaited them. But he pushed it down, focused on the weight of the pack on his back, the comforting presence of Egon at his side. This was it. The moment of truth. Whatever horrors lay beyond those doors, whatever nightmares made flesh, they would face them. Together. Egon met his gaze, a silent question in his eyes. Ray nodded, his grip tightening on his particle thrower, the cool metal a lifeline in the darkness. Then, with a deep breath, they pushed through the doors and into the unknown. The warehouse was a cavernous space, dimly lit by flickering fluorescent bulbs that cast eerie shadows across the cracked concrete floor. The air was thick and heavy, laden with the stench of dust and decay, a cloying sweetness that clung to the back of the throat. At first glance, it appeared to be abandoned, a forgotten tomb of rusting machinery and moldering boxes. But as they moved deeper into the gloom, Ray's PKE meter began to chirp and whine, the readings spiking with each step, the antennae twitching like insect legs. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, cold and clammy against his skin. "Egon," he whispered, his voice tight with tension, barely more than a breath. "Are you seeing this?" Egon nodded, his face pale and drawn in the ghostly light of his own meter, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "The energy signatures, they're everywhere surrounding us." Ray swallowed hard, his mouth filling with the coppery taste of fear. He could feel it now, the prickling sense of unseen eyes watching from the shadows, of malevolent presences closing in from all sides. The very air seemed to hum with a dark, pulsating energy, a subsonic throb that set his teeth on edge. And then, with a sudden, sickening lurch, reality tore itself inside out. The world exploded into a maelstrom of shrieking, ectoplasmic horror. Ghosts burst from the walls, the floor, the very air itself, a seething, writhing mass of tortured faces and grasping, clutching hands. They were twisted, malformed things, their shapes constantly shifting and morphing, as if they were struggling to hold themselves together. Their colors a nauseating kaleidoscope of sickly greens and pustulant yellows. And their faces, dear God, their faces, contorted in rictuses of agony and rage, mouths gaping in silent screams that echoed in the mind long after they had vanished from sight. Ray and Egon opened fire, the whine of their proton packs rising to a fever pitch as the beams of blazing blue-white light lanced through the maelstrom of ghosts. The air crackled with ozone, the stench of burnt ectoplasm searing the nostrils. But for every specter they managed to wrangle into the waiting trap, 2 more seemed to take its place, the horde pressing in with relentless, terrifying purpose. "There's too many of them," Ray shouted over the howl of the pack, his stream faltering as a particularly nasty ghost slammed into his chest, sending him staggering back against a rusted support beam. Pain exploded through his ribs, bright and hot, and for a moment his vision swam dangerously. "We need to regroup, find Peter and Winston." But even as he spoke, a chilling realization settled over him like a shroud, cold and leaden. The ghosts, they weren't attacking at random. They were hurting them, driving them deeper into the bowels of the warehouse, away from the doors and any hope of escape. And in that moment, Ray understood with a brutal, terrifying clarity, the pieces falling into place like a macabre jigsaw puzzle. This wasn't just another manifestation. It was a trap, and they had walked right into it. Chapter 15. The air crackled with energy as Ray and Egon stood back to back in the cavernous warehouse, their proton streams cutting swaths through the advancing horde of ghosts. Ectoplasmic entities of every shape and size surged towards them in a relentless, howling mass. Slimy tendrils grasped at their boots, and acrid, sulphurous fumes assaulted their nostrils as they fought to hold the line. But it was a losing battle. For every specter they managed to wrangle into their beams, a dozen more charged forward to take its place, their ghostly forms passing through crates and equipment as if they were nothing more than mist. The concrete walls shuddered from the force of their collective wailing. "Ray," Egon shouted, his voice nearly lost in the ear-splitting cacophony. Sweat poured down his face and his glasses were askew. "We're drastically outnumbered. We need to devise an exit strategy post-haste." Ray gritted his teeth, his jaw clenched tight enough to make his temples throb. His mind raced desperately even as he tried to keep his proton stream steady. Egon was right, damn it. The spooks had them surrounded, herded like cattle, driving them further from the exit with each passing second. If they didn't pull a rabbit out of their hat, and fast, this would be their last dance. But what could they do? The mechanisms of their packs were already starting to overheat from the strain of sustained fire, the nuclear accelerators whining in shrill protest. The hair on the back of Ray's neck stood on end as he felt the equipment grow alarmingly warm against his back. And even if they could somehow carve a path through the horde, then what? The entities had them boxed in, cut off from any hope of retreat. Despair began to sink its icy claws into Ray's chest. But then, just as hopelessness threatened to engulf him, he saw it. Movement flashed in the corner of his eye, and he whipped his head around to see a jumpsuited figure barreling towards them through the fray. "Winston!" Ray cried out, relief and renewed hope surging through his veins like a shot of adrenaline. "Over here!" Winston came charging through the supernatural melee like a linebacker, his proton stream blazing a glowing path of destruction through the seething mass of ghosts. Phantasms evaporated left and right in puffs of ionized particles. At his side was Peter, his normally smirking face now set in a grim mask of determination as he laid down covering fire.
"Fancy meeting you here,"
Peter called out, his voice dripping with strained levity as they fought their way to Ray and Egon's position. "Is it time for the ghost prom already? My invite must have gotten lost in the mail." Despite the life and death situation, Ray felt one corner of his mouth twitch upwards. Trust Peter to crack wise in the face of certain doom. The man's humor was as predictable as it was appalling. But there was no time to dwell on it. No sooner had the four Ghostbusters regrouped than a deep, ominous rumble began to build beneath their feet. The warehouse quaked and shuddered around them as if straining under an immense, unseen pressure. Dust cascaded from the rafters, and cracks raced up the walls.
"Aye, guys?"
Winston said, his rich baritone tight with strain, as he fought to keep his footing on the roiling ground. "I've got a real bad feeling about this." Ray opened his mouth, a half-formed theory on the tip of his tongue. But before he could utter a single syllable, a searing nova of light exploded from the center of the warehouse floor. The Ghostbusters cried out as one, throwing their arms up to shield their eyes. But it was no use. The blinding, pulsing brightness pierced through their very eyelids like the blazing heart of a star. And when the spots finally cleared from their vision and they lowered their hands, blanking away tears, Ray felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. There, hovering in the center of the warehouse, was a figure that defied description. Vaguely humanoid in shape, its form was woven from swirling, crackling tendrils of pure energy, a being of unfettered psychokinetic power given nightmarish form. And its eyes, dear God, its eyes. Twin pits of utter, consuming darkness that drank in all light, soulless voids that promised only oblivion. "Mother Puss Bucket," Peter breathed, his voice barely a whisper.
"What in the name of Gozer's jockstrap is that?"
Egon shook his head slowly, his complexion paling to a sickly gray. I have no idea. These PKE readings are astronomical, beyond anything in our current classification system. This entity is orders of magnitude above anything we've previously encountered." The figure turned its terrible, depthless gaze upon them, and Ray felt the marrow in his bones turn to slush. When it spoke, its voice was the rumble of galaxies colliding, the death rattle of stars.
"Ghostbusters."
The word boomed and echoed, as if spoken in the depths of a watery chasm. "You are meddling in matters beyond while your grasp ends now. The veil between realms thins, and the hour of the dead's return draws nigh." Ray's heart seized in his chest, and a primal terror flooded his psyche, drowning all thought in a tidal wave of dread. This thing, this monstrosity, it was the architect of their doom, the unseen puppet master orchestrating the thinning of the barrier between life and death. And now it had stepped from behind the curtain, and they were less than insects before its power. "W.O.W. Hatter, you?" Egon choked out, his vocals cords straining with the effort. The entity swelled, its form crackling and distorting as unfathomable energies raged within. "I am HEWHO heralds the twilight of MAN, the BRINGER of darkness unending, and you, wretched mortals, are less than dust motes before the oncoming storm." It extended a hand, a swirling vortex of light and power, and leveled it at the Ghostbusters' raw energy sparking from its fingertips. "You are feeble crusade ISATANN, the reign of the living is over." And with those terrible words still hanging in the air, the Harbinger unleashed a maelstrom of unfettered psychokinetic force that sundered the fabric of reality itself. The Ghostbusters didn't even have time to scream. Ray felt himself lifted off his feet, as if he weighed no more than a leaf, his body flung utterly helpless before the onslaught. He slammed into the warehouse wall like a rag doll, every atom of his being flaring hot and cold with agony. Distantly, as if through a long tunnel, he could hear the screams of his fellow Ghostbusters, their anguished cries merging into a hellish chorus as they too were tossed about in the psychic gale. And above it all, audible even over the roaring in his ears, the terrible, soul-chilling laughter of the Harbinger. Mocking, triumphant, heralding a doom beyond all imagining. As the shadows crept in around the edges of Ray's vision and the world began to spin and fade, one final, broken thought crystallized in the ruins of his mind. It was over. The Ghostbusters had finally met their match. And the price of their failure would be paid by all of humanity. Chapter 16. Ray awoke to a world of pain, every nerve ending in his body screaming in agony. He let out a low, guttural groan as the throbbing ache pulsed through his muscles and bones. His eyelids fluttered open reluctantly, but the sight that greeted him made him immediately wish he had kept them shut. He found himself sprawled on the cold, unforgiving concrete of the warehouse floor, limbs splayed out at unnatural angles like a broken marionette. Each labored breath sent stabbing pains lancing through his chest, his battered ribs protesting the expansion of his lungs. It seemed inconceivable that he was still alive, that his heart continued to pump blood through his veins despite the trauma his body had endured. Alive! The word resonated through Ray's sluggish thoughts, igniting a desperate spark within him. He needed to know what had happened, to piece together the fractured memories. Gritting his teeth, he summoned every ounce of strength and determination, pushing against the floor with trembling arms until he managed to prop himself up on his elbows. His muscles quivered and spasmed, crying out in protest, but he ignored their pleas for respite. As Ray's vision cleared, he took in the devastation surrounding him. The once sturdy walls of the warehouse had been reduced to piles of rubble, gaping holes torn through the ceiling to reveal glimpses of the sky above. Golden shafts of sunlight streamed down like spotlights, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and casting an almost ethereal glow over the scene of destruction. The contrast between the warm, inviting light and the cold horror of reality was jarringly discordant. Ray's gaze fell upon the motionless forms of his fellow Ghostbusters, their bodies strewn haphazardly amidst the debris like forgotten ragdolls. His breath caught in his throat, a choked no escaping his lips in a hoarse whisper. He repeated the denial over and over, his voice cracking with each utterance, as if the words alone could undo the awful truth before his eyes. Desperation fueling his movements, Ray dragged himself towards the nearest figure, his body screaming with every inch gain. As he drew closer, he recognized Peter's distinctive features, now slack and lifeless. A thin rivulet of crimson blood traced a macabre path from the corner of Peter's mouth, stark against his ashen skin. "Peter," Ray rasped, his hand shaking violently as he reached out to grip his friend's shoulder. He shook him, gently at first, then with increasing urgency. "Peter, wake up, please, God, wake up." Ray's plea hung in the air, met only by a suffocating silence that seemed to stretch into an eternity. Hope dwindled with each passing second, an icy dread settling in the pit of his stomach. But then, miraculously, Peter stirred. A low, pained groan rumbled in his chest as his eyelids fluttered open, unfocused gaze slowly sharpening. "Ray?" Peter slurred, his normally smooth voice rough and gravelly. What happened?" Relief crashed over Ray like a tidal wave, so intense it nearly brought tears to his eyes. He swallowed hard, forcing the words past the lump in his throat. "The Harbinger," he said grimly, the name tasting bitter on his tongue. "It attacked us, knocked us out cold, I thought." He trailed off, unable to give voice to the terrible fear that had gripped him. Instead, he turned his attention to Egon and Winston, crawling to each of them in turn to check for signs of life with trembling hands. To Ray's immense relief and gratitude, they were both alive, worse for wear, but alive. Winston sported a deep gash across his forehead, dark blood matting his hair and trickling down his temple. Egon's glasses lay shattered nearby, the frames bent and twisted nearly beyond recognition. But the steady rise and fall of their chests, and the strong, reassuring throb of their pulses beneath Ray's fingertips, confirmed that they had survived the Harbinger's brutal assault.
"What do we do now?"
Peter asked, his voice strained as he struggled to push himself upright on unsteady arms. "That Harbinger is too powerful, Ray. We're in no shape to take it on like this."
Ray shook his head vehemently, a steely resolve hardening his features, even as fear threatened to overwhelm him. "We don't have a choice," he said firmly, his voice steady despite the tempest of emotions raging within him.
"Remember what the Harbinger said about the veil between worlds weakening, the dead rising to walk among the living if we don't stop it." He let the horrifying implication hang unsaid in the air between them, the unspoken understanding of the catastrophe that would befall them all if they failed in their duty. A world overrun by vengeful spirits, the fragile barrier separating life and death crumbling to dust. Unimaginable chaos, destruction and suffering on a global scale, the end of life as they knew it. "Ray's right," Egon interjected, his normally impassive voice tight with pain as he hauled himself to his feet with painstaking effort. "We're the world's only defense against this threat. The fate of billions rests on our shoulders." Winston nodded grimly, his jaw clenched with unwavering determination as he retrieved his battered proton pack from the rubble. "Then let's show this Harbinger exactly who it's messing with," he declared, resolve burning bright in his eyes.
"Time to do what we do best, kick some supernatural ass."
United by purpose, the Ghostbusters gathered their equipment, assessing damage and jerry-rigging hasty field repairs with trembling fingers and adrenaline-fueled concentration. Though their proton packs bore scars from the battle, dented and scorched in places, the familiar hum of the cyclotron and glow of the neutrona wand remained a comforting constant. They were still operational, still their last and greatest line of defense against the forces of evil that threatened their world.
As Ray looked around at his battered team, taking in their determined expressions and battle-ready stances, a fierce surge of affection and pride swelled in his chest.
These men, his brothers in arms, had weathered countless horrors by his side, stared down nightmares incarnate without flinching. No matter how dire the circumstances or how impossible the odds, they always found a way to emerge victorious. Unbreakable. Unstoppable.
"All right, guys, listen up," Ray said, his voice ringing out strong and clear.
"Here's the plan. We track down that Harbinger and hit it with everything we've got. Proton streams, traps, slime blowers, the whole enchilada. And if worst comes to worst." He met each of their gazes in turn, a flicker of grim humor dancing in his eyes despite the gravity of the situation. "We cross the streams." Peter arched an incredulous eyebrow, a wry half-smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Cross the streams, correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't that expressly forbidden in the Ghostbusters handbook? Something about every molecule in our bodies exploding at the speed of light.
Ray squared his shoulders, facing down Peter's snark with unwavering conviction.
Desperate times call for desperate measures, Venkman. We're playing for all the marbles here. Sometimes you gotta roll the hard six. Slowly, Peter nodded, his smile sharpening into something fierce and feral. Well, when you put it like that, I say we go for broke. Let's torch this spectral son of a bitch. As one, the Ghostbusters stepped out into the harsh light of day, leaving the crumbling ruins of the warehouse behind them. The distant skyline of New York stretched out before them, proud spires of glass and steel glittering beneath the sun's golden rays, blissfully unaware of the looming supernatural threat poised to consume everything in its path. But they knew. This city, this world, it was theirs to protect, their solemn duty and sworn oath. No matter the danger, no matter the cost, they would fulfill that sacred vow. Ray's grip tightened on his proton gun as he surveyed his team, eyes blazing with determination.
Let's do this, Ghostbusters, he declared, his voice a rallying cry. Time to save the world.
Without hesitation, they strode forward as one, bruised and bloodied, but far from broken. Ready to face the Harbinger head-on, to fight to their last breath for the fate of everything they held dear. Come what may, they would stand together. They would triumph together. Always.
Chapter 17.
They found the Harbinger in Central Park, hovering above the Bethesda Terrace like a malevolent god. The once bustling heart of the city was eerily silent, the usually vibrant greenery withered and dead, as if the very life had been drained from the earth. A fetid stench hung in the air, the cloying scent of decay and despair. And all around the Harbinger, writhing and swirling like a maelstrom, the ghosts. Hundreds of them, thousands, an endless sea of spectral horrors. They filled the air with their wails and moans, a cacophony of torment that rent the very fabric of reality. Twisted, agonized faces leered from the swirling vortex, skeletal hands grasping at the void. The Ghostbusters stood at the edge of the maelstrom, staring up at the nightmare made manifest. Egon raised a PKE meter with a trembling hand, eyes wide behind his glasses as the readings spiked into the red.
My God,
Egon breathed, his face ashen. The PKE readings, they're astronomical. The concentration of psychokinetic energy in this spot, it's tearing the veil apart.
Ray swallowed hard, his heart hammering against his ribs as he took in the terrifying sight.
He could feel it in his bones, a primal, instinctive terror that turned his blood to ice. The Harbinger was drawing power from the ghosts, using them as a conduit to bridge the gap between the living and the dead. And if it succeeded, if the barriers fell. He shuddered, not wanting to contemplate the consequences.
Steeling himself, Ray turned to his fellow Ghostbusters, jaw set with determination.
We have to stop it, he said, his voice shaking despite his efforts to keep it steady. Now, before it's too late. Peter nodded, uncharacteristically serious as he gripped his proton gun tight. Okay, guys, this is it, the big one. He glanced at each of them in turn, something like fondness mixed with the fear in his eyes.
Whatever happens, it's been an honor busting with you.
Winston clapped a hand on Peter's shoulder, a flicker of warmth managing to shine through the grim resolve on his face. Likewise, Venkman, let's do this. They fanned out, taking up positions around the seething vortex of specters. Ray could feel the crackle of psychokinetic energy in the air, a static charge that made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. It prickled over his skin, an almost tangible force. This was the moment, the culmination of everything they had trained for. The fate of the world hung in the balance, teetering on the razor's edge between salvation and damnation. Ray raised his proton gun, finger tightening on the trigger as he sighted down the barrel at the Harbinger's swirling form. "On my mark," he said, surprised at the steadiness of his own voice. 3, 2, 1, fire. The proton streams lanced out, searing beams of nuclear energy that cut through the seething mass of ghosts like a knife through butter. The smell of ozone and scorched ectoplasm filled the air. The Harbinger reeled back, its form flickering and wavering under the onslaught, an inhuman screech tearing from its spectral throat. But it was far from defeated. With a roar of rage that shook the earth, the Harbinger lashed out, tendrils of dark energy whipping through the air like the limbs of some monstrous kraken. The Ghostbusters scattered, diving for cover as the ground erupted in geysers of dirt and rubble. Ray hit the ground hard, rolling to absorb the impact. He scrambled back to his feet, heart pounding fit to burst from his chest. The Harbinger was too strong, its power too vast. For every ghost they wrangled, a dozen more poured forth to take its place. Their proton streams, as potent as they were, barely seemed to faze the monstrosity. But they couldn't give up. Not now, not with everything on the line. Gritting his teeth, Ray charged back into the fray, proton stream blazing. "Keep firing," he shouted over the howling din, voice ragged with exertion and desperation. "We have to weaken it, give the traps a chance." They poured it on, the proton streams sizzling and crackling as they bored into the Harbinger's swirling form. The air seared with the stench of burning ectoplasm. The entity screamed, a sound that was felt rather than heard, a psychic howl of rage and pain that tore at the edges of sanity. Ray's skull felt like it was splitting in two, the pressure building behind his eyes until he thought they might burst. And then, impossibly, it began to falter. The maelstrom of ghosts wavered, tendrils of dark energy starting to fray and dissipate under the relentless assault. The Harbinger's form guttered like a candle flame in a hurricane, flickering and dimming. "It's working," Egon cried, voice strangled with a wild, desperate hope. "The streams are disrupting its cohesion. Keep it up." Galvanized, the Ghostbusters redoubled their efforts. Sweat poured down their straining faces, plastering their hair to their skulls as they gritted their teeth and dug deep for every last ounce of strength. The Harbinger thrashed and writhed in its death throes, shrieks rising to a deafening crescendo that drowned out all other sound. And then, with a final ear-splitting roar, it shattered. The web of dark energy that had held it together exploded outward in a massive shockwave of psychokinetic force. It slammed into the Ghostbusters like a runaway freight train, lifting them off their feet and sending them tumbling end over end through the air. Ray hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs by the impact. He lay stunned for a moment, ears ringing and vision swimming, the world tilting around him like a capsizing ship. Everything hurt, a bone-deep ache that seemed to radiate from his very core. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up onto his elbows, blinking to clear his blurry vision. As the world gradually swam back into focus, Ray felt his heart stutter in his chest. The ghosts, the endless horde that had blotted out the sky, they were gone. Vanished, as if they had never been. In their place, drifting gently down like glowing snowflakes, was a fine, glittering powder that seemed almost to shine with an inner light. Ectoplasmic residue, the last remnants of the Harbinger's form, settling over the scorched and battle-scarred earth. A ragged cheer went up from the battered Ghostbusters as they staggered back to their feet,
leaning on each other for support. They were bruised, bloodied, but alive. Victorious. "We did it," Peter said, voice hoarse with exhaustion and giddy relief. "We actually did it." Ray couldn't help the weary grin that tugged at his lips, an almost manic laugh bubbling up his ravaged throat. Against all odds, in the face of an enemy that had seemed invincible, they had triumphed. The city was safe, the world spared from the spectral apocalypse. But even as he basked in the warm glow of victory, even as he pulled his battered comrades into a crushing embrace, a flicker of unease stirred in the pit of Ray's stomach. The Harbinger's final words, just before it had shattered, echoed in his mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. "The veil is torn, the way is open. This is only the beginning." What did it mean? Was the Harbinger truly vanquished, or merely the vanguard of some greater horror waiting in the wings? Had they bought the world a reprieve with their blood and sweat and courage, or only delayed the inevitable? Ray swallowed hard, the brief euphoria of victory already starting to curdle in his gut. He didn't know what the future held, what nightmares might yet lurk beyond the tattered veil between worlds. None of them did. But as he stood there amidst the ruins of their battleground, shoulder to shoulder with the men who had become closer than brothers, one thing crystallized in Ray's mind with diamond-hard certainty. Come what may, whatever fresh horrors the breach might unleash, they would face it. Together. Armed with proton packs and PKE meters, with courage and camaraderie and indomitable human spirit. The Ghostbusters. The world's last, best hope, standing fast against the darkness. And God help any eldritch abomination that dared stand in their way. Chapter 18. The days that followed were a blur of activity and celebration. The city, shaken to its core by the events in Central Park, rallied around the Ghostbusters like never before. They were hailed as heroes, saviors, the bravest of the brave. On the streets, people stopped them for autographs and photos, their faces beaming with gratitude and awe. Children played with toy proton packs, dreaming of one day joining the hallowed ranks of their idols. Storefronts displayed signs proclaiming "Ghostbusters save the day" and "Thank you, Ghostbusters." Flower bouquets, heartfelt cards, and tokens of appreciation piled up at the firehouse door. The media clamored for interviews, each outlet vying for an exclusive with the conquering heroes. Cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions as the team navigated the sea of microphones and notepads. In a cramped TV studio, under the glare of bright lights, Peter leaned back in his chair, a satisfied smirk on his face. Well, it was a tough battle, but hey, that's why they call us the best in the business. Ghosts don't stand a chance against the Ghostbusters. The audience erupted in applause and cheers. At a press conference outside City Hall, Mayor Lenny shook each of their hands vigorously, his grin wide and relieved. On behalf of the people of New York City, I extend my deepest gratitude to Dr. Spengler, Dr. Stantz, Dr. Venkman, and Mr. Zeddemore. These men are true heroes, the guardians of our great city against the paranormal threats that most can scarcely imagine. We are forever in their debt. Flashbulbs popped and cameras whirred, immortalizing the moment. But despite the accolades and adoration, a shadow hung over the proceedings, a chilling echo that only Ray seemed to hear. In quiet moments, the Harbinger's last words crept unbidden into his thoughts, like icy tendrils snaking through his mind. This is only the beginning. Late at night, in the silence of the emptied firehouse, he pored over the arcane tomes and obscure data printouts that littered his cluttered desk. The only sound was the hum of equipment and the occasional rustle of paper as he searched desperately for any scrap of knowledge, any clue that could shed light on the impending danger. Egon often joined him, the two men working in almost wordless synchronicity, fueled by a shared sense of urgency. They analyzed PKE readings, studied ectoplasmic samples, debated metaphysical theories in hushed, intense voices. But the answers remained frustratingly elusive, dancing just beyond the edge of understanding. On the rare occasions they emerged, bleary-eyed and unshaven, the others regarded them with concern. Winston, bless him, would press cups of strong coffee into their hands, his warm eyes full of unspoken support. Even Peter's usual jibes held a note of worry, his bravado a thin mask over the fear they all shared but dared not voice. And still the dreams came, night after night, each more terrifying than the last. Visions of a world in ruins, choked by ash and echoing with the screams of the damned. Of the Harbinger reborn, an obscene colossus towering over the blasted landscape, its laughter a promise of annihilation. Ray would bolt awake, sweat-drenched and shaking. The images seared into his mind like a brand. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they were more than mere nightmares. They were portents, glimpses of a future that loomed like a gathering storm, vast and implacable. A future in which all their struggles, all their triumphs, would be rendered meaningless in the face of an evil beyond imagining. And so he soldiered on, driven by desperation and a grim sense of duty. He consulted mediums, pored over prophecies, sought out whispers of half-forgotten lore. Each dead end, each false lead, only added to the gnawing fear in the pit of his stomach, the certainty that time was running out. Ray could feel it in his bones, a looming, inescapable dread that no amount of daylight or laughter could fully banish. Something was coming, a horror that would make the battle in Central Park seem like a child's game in comparison. And if they failed, if they couldn't find a way to stop it. He shuddered to think of the consequences, the hell that would be unleashed upon an unsuspecting world. But even that paled in comparison to the cold, creeping fear that settled in his heart, the terrifying certainty that when the time came, when the final confrontation was upon them, not even the Ghostbusters would be enough to save the world from what lay ahead. Chapter 19. It was a quiet, unremarkable Tuesday when the call came in. Ray Stantz was hunched over a workbench in the cluttered lab of the Ghostbusters firehouse headquarters, his brow furrowed in concentration as he pored over a set of PKE readings that stubbornly refused to make sense. Beside him, Egon Spengler adjusted his glasses, peering at the oscillating lines on the screen with an intensity that would have unnerved a lesser man. Across town, Peter Venkman and Winston Zeddemore were out on a routine bust, their proton packs humming reassuringly as they cornered a minor Class 3 entity in the dingy basement of a Bronx apartment building. Peter's usual wisecracking bravado was tempered by a hint of weariness. It had been a long week of chasing down errant spirits, while Winston moved with the cool efficiency of a seasoned professional, his dark eyes watchful for any sudden movements from their quarry. And then, back in the firehouse, the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the hushed concentration like a knife. Janine Melnitz, the Ghostbusters' unflappable secretary, picked up the receiver with a crisp, "Ghostbusters, what do you want?" Her eyes widened as she listened, her face draining of color. "Ray," she called out, her voice tight and strained, "you better get up here, we've got a situation." Ray took the stairs two at a time, his heart pounding against his ribs. Dread coiled in his gut like a cold snake, a primal sense of foreboding that he couldn't quite shake. When he burst into the reception area, Janine was standing ramrod straight, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge of her desk. She pointed to the small TV in the corner, her hand trembling slightly.
On the screen, a scene of chaos and horror unfolded. Times Square, the pulsing heart of the city, was overrun by ghosts. They poured from the sewers, from the cracks in the sidewalks, from the very air itself, a seething, writhing mass of spectral horrors that lashed out at everything in their path. Screams rent the air as panicked civilians fled in all directions, their faces contorted in terror. And there, at the center of it all, looming over the square like a malevolent god, was the Harbinger. Reborn, remade, just as in Ray's worst nightmares. It towered over the buildings, a swirling vortex of dark energy that pulsed with an unholy light. Its laughter echoed from the speakers, a sound that chilled Ray to the very marrow of his bones. "No," he whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "It can't be. We stopped it. We destroyed it." But even as the words left his lips, he knew they were a lie. The evidence was right there in front of him, undeniable and terrifying. The Harbinger was back. And this time, it had an army. He turned to Janine, his hands shaking as he gripped her shoulders. "Get Peter and Winston back here, now," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Tell them it's a code zero, and call the mayor, the governor, anyone who'll listen, tell them." He swallowed hard, the words sticking in his throat like shards of glass. "Tell them the Ghostbusters need help." The minutes that followed were a blur of frantic activity and barely contained terror. Ray paced the floor, his mind racing as he tried to formulate a plan, any plan, to stop the Harbinger and its ghostly horde. Egon retreated to the lab, frantically calibrating their equipment and running calculations, his face set in grim determination. Peter and Winston burst into the firehouse in a clatter of proton packs and heavy boots, their faces drawn and haggard. They had seen the news, seen the horror that was unfolding in the heart of their city. There was no time for their usual banter or quits. The gravity of the situation hung over them like a suffocating shroud. They geared up in tense silence, checking their packs, loading their traps with methodical precision. Every movement was heavy with purpose. Every glance weighted with unspoken fears. This was it. The moment they had all been dreading, the final battle they had hoped would never come. The Ecto-1 roared to life, its sirens wailing and lights flashing as it tore out of the firehouse and into the chaotic streets. The city was in pandemonium, the roads choked with panicked citizens fleeing the carnage in Times Square. They wove through the gridlock with reckless abandon, the adrenaline pumping through their veins like molten fire. And then, suddenly, they were there. The eye of the ghostly storm, the maelstrom of spectral fury that had engulfed the heart of Manhattan. The Harbinger loomed above them, its form pulsing and writhing with malevolent energy. The air crackled with power, the very fabric of reality straining at the seams. "Foolish mortals," the entity's voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath their feet. "You thought you could defeat me. I am eternal. I am the end of all things." Ray stepped forward, his proton gun humming with power, his jaw set in grim determination. "We beat you once, you son of a bitch," he snarled, his voice raw with emotion. "We'll do it again." The Harbinger's laughter was like the tolling of a funeral bell, deep and cold and utterly devoid of humanity. "You only delayed the inevitable. The veil is torn, the dead walk the earth, and I am their king." It raised its arms in a gesture of dark benediction, and the ghosts surged forward like a tidal wave of ectoplasmic horror. The Ghostbusters opened fire, their proton streams sizzling through the air in brilliant arcs of light and fury. But it was like trying to hold back the ocean with a broom. For every ghost they wrangled, a dozen more took its place,
an endless tide of spectral malevolence that threatened to overwhelm them utterly. And then, just when all seemed lost, when the darkness seemed poised to swallow them whole, a miracle. The wail of sirens, the thrum of helicopter blades, the pounding of boots on pavement. The cavalry had arrived at last. Every law enforcement agency and military unit in the tri-state area converging on Times Square in a desperate last stand against the ghostly horde. They fought shoulder to shoulder with the Ghostbusters, a ragtag army of humanity standing firm against the forces of darkness. Tanks rolled through the streets, their cannons blazing with ghostly fire. Missile launchers belched smoke and flame, their payloads slamming into the Harbinger with concussive force. SWAT teams and snipers took up positions on the rooftops, pouring withering fire into the seething mass of ectoplasmic horrors. But even with all their strength, all their courage and determination, it wasn't enough. The Harbinger was too strong, its power too vast, its hold on the mortal world too complete. It shrugged off their attacks like raindrops, its laughter echoing across the battlefield like the tolling of a funeral bell. And in that moment, Ray knew what he had to do. The last resort, the final gambit, the thing they had sworn never to attempt again. The only thing that could stop the Harbinger, once and for all. Cross the streams. He turned to his friends, his brothers in arms, his eyes blazing with desperate resolve. Guys, we have to do it. It's the only way. Egon shook his head, his face pale and drawn behind his glasses. Ray, you know what happened last time, the risk. I know, Ray said, his voice steady and sure. But it's our only chance. If we don't stop the Harbinger here and now, if we don't end this, it's all over. For all of us, for everyone. Peter and Winston exchanged a long look, a silent moment of perfect understanding. Then, as one, they nodded, their faces set in grim determination. Okay, Ray, Peter said, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Let's do this one last ride. They took up positions around the Harbinger, forming a loose circle, their proton packs humming with building power. The streams lanced out, sizzling and crackling, as they met in the center of the entity's swirling form, a dazzling display of light and fury that seared the eyes and set the teeth on edge. The Harbinger screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony that sent icy fingers crawling down the spine. Its form shuddered and convulsed, the dark energy that sustained it beginning to unravel like a fraying tapestry. Now, Ray shouted, his voice raw and ragged with strain. Full power. They poured everything they had into the streams, every ounce of strength, every shred of will and determination. The proton packs whined and shuddered, pushed far beyond their limits, the very fabric of space-time beginning to warp and twist around them. And then, with a final ear-splitting roar that shook the very foundations of the city, the Harbinger exploded. A shockwave of pure psychokinetic energy ripped through Times Square, a searing blast of light and sound that knocked the Ghostbusters from their feet and sent them tumbling like leaves in a hurricane. Silence fell over the battlefield, thick and heavy and absolute. The ghosts, the seething horde that had threatened to engulf the city, were gone, vanished like mist before the rising sun. And in their place, drifting gently down from the sky like flakes of ash, the last remnants of the Harbinger, dissolving into ectoplasmic residue as they touched the ground. Ray struggled to his feet, his ears ringing, his vision swimming with dark spots. Around him the others were stirring, groaning with pain and exhaustion, their faces streaked with sweat and grime. But they were alive, battered and bruised, their bodies aching with 1,000 hurts, but unbroken, unbowed. They had done the impossible, had stood against the darkness, and emerged victorious. The Ghostbusters, the world's last line of defense against the things that went bump in the night. They had saved the city, saved the world. And as the sun began to rise over the shattered remains of Times Square, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Ray felt a sense of peace wash over him, a bone-deep weariness that was shot through with fierce, unyielding pride. They had won. Against all odds, against all reason and sanity, they had won. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. Chapter 20, Epilogue. The crisp autumn air carried a hint of smoke and ash as the sun rose over the battle-scarred streets of New York City. In the weeks since that fateful confrontation in Times Square, the rhythm of life had slowly returned, but the city wore its wounds like a badge of honor. Shattered windows gaped like missing teeth in the facades of skyscrapers, and potholes from errant proton streams pockmarked the asphalt. Yet amidst the rubble, a spirit of resilience and determination took root. At the heart of the city's rebirth stood the Ghostbusters, the unlikely heroes who had stared into the face of annihilation and never blinked. Ray Stantz took a deep breath as he stepped out of the converted firehouse that served as their headquarters, savoring the tang of coffee and ectoplasm that always seemed to linger in the air. The others were close behind Egon, his brow furrowed in thought as he jotted down equations in a tattered notebook. Peter, a wisecrack already dancing on his lips, and Winston, steady and unflappable as ever. As they piled into the battle-scarred Ecto-1, Ray couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. It seemed like only yesterday that they were scraping by, dismissed as frauds and lunatics by a skeptical public. But now they were legends, their names spoken with reverence and awe. The mayor had declared a citywide holiday in their honor, and the streets were lined with cheering crowds as they drove past in a blur of sirens and flashing lights. Children waved handmade signs with crayoned renditions of the team, their proton packs firing beams of multicolored light. Grown men and women openly wept, reaching out to touch the Ecto-1 as if it were a sacred relic. At a massive ceremony in Central Park, the president himself draped medals around their necks, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke of courage and sacrifice. Ray stood tall, his heart swelling with pride as the sunlight glinted off the polished brass. This was their moment, the culmination of everything they had fought for. But even as they basked in the accolades and adulation, Ray couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that gnawed at the back of his mind. He could still hear the Harbinger's final words echoing in his ears, taunting him with their grim certainty. "You have won this battle," the entity had hissed, its vacant eyes boring into Ray's soul. "But the war is far from over." Those words haunted Ray's dreams, jolting him awake in the dead of night, drenched in icy sweat. He saw them scrawled in the whorls of his morning coffee, whispered in the wind that rattled the firehouse windows. The others felt it too, he knew, the unshakable sense that this reprieve was only temporary, that somewhere in the darkness, new threats were gathering. But they would be ready. Ray glanced around the firehouse, taking in the ordered chaos that had become their world. Proton packs hung from the walls like ancient tapestries, their wiring exposed and humming with barely contained power. Egon hunched over a cluttered workbench, his deft fingers dancing over circuit boards and ectoplasmic residue. Peter lounged in a battered armchair, his feet propped up on a stack of arcane tomes, as he absently toyed with a PKE meter. And Winston, ever the voice of reason, methodically cleaned and checked each piece of equipment with a soldier's precision. They were more than a team, Ray realized, that they were a family, bound by the unbreakable ties of shared struggle and sacrifice. They had seen the face of true evil,
felt its fetid breath on their necks and emerged stronger for it. Together, they were an unstoppable force, a bulwark against the darkness that threatened to consume the world. So when the alarm klaxon split the air, its wailing cry a portent of new horrors to come, they didn't hesitate. Ray was the first to reach the proton packs, slinging the thrumming nuclear accelerator onto his back with practiced ease. The others were only seconds behind, their faces set with grim determination as they piled into the Ecto-1 in a flash of blue and orange. As Winston gunned, the engine and the siren shrieked to life, Ray allowed himself a tight smile. This was what they were made for, the thrill of the hunt, the rush of adrenaline that came with staring down the unknown. Ghosts, demons, ancient Sumerian gods, it didn't matter. They would face them all, and they would win. Because they were the Ghostbusters, now and forever. The Ecto-1 tore through the streets of New York like a comet, leaving a trail of smoking pavement in its wake. Over the scream of the engine, Ray heard Peter's voice, dripping with its usual sardonic wit. "Okay, boys, let's light 'em up." And as the car raced towards the unknown, the Ghostbusters cradled their particle throwers and prepared for war. This was their calling, their solemn duty to be the light in the darkness, the final hope for a world besieged by nightmares. They were the Ghostbusters, and may God help anything foolish enough to stand in their way. The end.